It began with an idea, not a gunshot, not a marching column, not a speech. Just an idea. A military concept so radical that the old generals laughed at it. A strategy so fast that it defied every rule the world thought it understood about war. In an age when leaders planned their battles by counting infantry and measuring trenches, one man believed that victory had nothing to do with numbers or size, but with movement. His name was Heinz Guderian. While others studied the last war, he imagined the next. While others dug in, he tore through. While others built defences, he built speed. Historians later tried to soften the truth that one man changed modern warfare, but there is no avoiding it. The world had never seen anything like the concept he refined and unleashed. The Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. War that struck so fast that armies could not respond, nations could not breathe, and commanders could not keep up. Heinz Guderian was not just the father of Blitzkrieg, he was the architect of an entirely new form of war. Long before tanks punched through Poland, before France fell in a matter of weeks, before Europe trembled at the sight of armoured columns appearing out of fog and smoke, Guderian was a young signals officer buried in telephones and radios. He did not come from a background of bold cavalry charges or heroic battlefield tales. He came from communication, from messages, from coordination. In the First World War, he watched artillery units destroy trenches with mathematical precision, only for generals to send waves of men across open ground into slaughter. He understood something that his superiors did not. The battlefield was not failing because soldiers weren't brave enough. It was failing because commanders could not see the battlefield in real time. War was not slow because soldiers lacked courage. It was slow because armies lacked speed of information. Guderian saw tanks not as armoured beasts, but as moving engines of coordination. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft not working separately, but as one fluid organism, striking from multiple angles at once. Speed, shock, and surprise. He obsessed over radios, pushing for every tank to carry one. Other generals laughed. Why would a tank need a radio? They asked. To win, Guderian answered. He studied every armoured theory in Europe. He travelled to Sweden, Britain, and the Soviet Union observing tank manoeuvres, collecting ideas, absorbing everything. Then he synthesized it into a doctrine of unstoppable motion. Not slow, grinding war, not trench warfare, not attrition, but a breakthrough that turned battle from chess into checkmate. When Hitler came to power, Guderian saw opportunity. He was not motivated by ideology, he was motivated by a chance to build the army of the future. He pushed relentlessly for armoured divisions, for mechanized infantry, for mobile warfare. The resistance from old generals was suffocating. They clung to their horses, their memories of the last war, their rigid doctrines. But Guderian kept fighting in meetings, in reports, in training manuals, in arguments that lasted well past midnight. He was not polite. He was not patient. He was right. Then, Blitzkrieg was unleashed. In Poland, armoured spearheads sliced through defences like surgical knives. In France, the breakthrough at Sedan, led by Guderian, shattered the French line in 3 days. 3 days to crack a fortress nation. Tanks advanced, while headquarters told him to stop. Guderian ignored them. He kept advancing, pushing deeper, faster, harder. Paris fell in weeks, not months. The world gasped. Britain reeled. Generals everywhere studied the maps and realized they were witnessing the death of the old world. But genius is dangerous when it serves a madman. Guderian's tactical brilliance had elevated Hitler's confidence to delusion. When Guderian argued for retreat on the Eastern Front, Hitler screamed back, "No step." Guderian resigned in protest. Later, Hitler brought him back not because he admitted his mistakes, but because he needed Guderian's genius to save a collapsing front. Even then, Guderian clashed constantly with Hitler. He understood what Hitler would never accept. War is not won by emotion, it is won by logistics, mobility, and timing. By the end of the war, Guderian watched the strategy he created drown in the consequences of the regime he helped empower. Blitzkrieg had brought lightning. Hitler brought the storm. Guderian escaped execution after the war, wrote memoirs, defended his tactics, and shaped how history would remember him. He insisted that he was just a soldier, not a politician. But history holds a harder truth. Genius does not exist in isolation. It serves someone. And whoever it serves shapes what that genius becomes. Guderian reshaped war, but war, in turn, reshaped him. Tonight, we return to the moment when modern warfare changed forever. To the first tank engines warming in morning fog. To the radios crackling with orders no army had ever heard before. To the man who stood over a map and said, "Faster." This is the entire history of Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, creator of modern armoured warfare, and a reminder that brilliance without conscience becomes fuel for forces beyond one's control. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you right now, and what time is it as you press play? Are you listening while the city outside your window sleeps? Or maybe lying in bed with the lights off, letting the past wash over you? I want to picture that exact moment. And if these deep, slow journeys through history help you relax, reflect, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. It tells me that someone out there values patient, meaningful storytelling, and it keeps me motivated to create the next chapter for you. October 15th, 1918. A German signals officer crouched in a muddy trench near Cambrai, watching his world collapse. Lieutenant Heinz Guderian pressed field glasses to his eyes as British Mark IV tanks rumbled across no man's land, their steel hulls shrugging off machine gun fire that would have shredded infantry. Around him, German soldiers, veterans who had held this line for 3 years, broke and ran. The tanks advanced at walking speed, barely 5 miles per hour, yet they moved with the inevitability of a geological force. In 6 hours, they achieved what months of artillery bombardment could not: a 5-mile breakthrough into German lines. Guderian lowered his binoculars, and in that moment, he understood something the generals in their distant headquarters did not. The war was already lost, but the future of all war had just revealed itself. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian was born in 1888 into a world of Prussian military tradition, the son of an officer who expected nothing less than a life in uniform. He joined the army in 1907. A young man in an institution that worshipped infantry and cavalry, where technology meant better rifles and faster horses. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Guderian served not in the glorious cavalry charges he'd imagined, but as a communications officer, stringing telephone wire, managing signal posts, coordinating the invisible flow of information that made armies function. It was unglamorous work, the kind that earned no medals, but it gave him something more valuable than glory. It taught him to see warfare as a system, a problem of coordination and timing rather than just courage and firepower. While infantry officers learned to lead men into machine gun fire, Guderian learned how armies talk to themselves, how information moves, how decisions cascade from commanders to the front line. This perspective, systems over heroics, would define everything he later created. By October 1918, the communications officer had seen enough slaughter to last several lifetimes. He had watched infantry attacks dissolve into casualty lists, seen territorial gains measured in yards after months of bombardment. The Western Front had become a mathematical nightmare. Every 100 yards gained cost thousands of lives, and the math never worked in anyone's favour. Then came Cambrai, and Guderian watched British tanks do in hours what infantry couldn't achieve in months. The German High Command quickly developed its explanation. Tanks were why Germany lost. They told themselves this story, crafted their narrative of betrayal and technical surprise. But Guderian, reading captured British tank manuals by candlelight in his tent, reached a different conclusion entirely. Tanks weren't why Germany lost, they were the weapon that would transform every future conflict. While his superiors blamed tanks for their defeat, he saw them as the solution to the stalemate that had defined this war. November 11th, 1918. The armistice came, and with it, Germany's humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles carved up the nation's territory, imposed crushing reparations, and dismantled the military machine that had been Prussia's pride. The German army, the mighty force that had fought the world to a standstill, was reduced to exactly 100,000 men, forbidden to possess tanks, aircraft, or heavy artillery. The General Staff itself was outlawed, officially dissolved as a dangerous institution of militarism. To the Allied powers crafting peace in Paris, these restrictions would prevent German aggression for generations. They had just created the most dangerous possible situation. A proud military tradition, utterly humiliated, with every incentive to rebuild in secret, and no restraint from conventional thinking. You don't neutralize a threat by stripping away its weapons while leaving its knowledge and will intact. You just force it to innovate. Guderian found himself assigned to the skeletal Reichswehr in January 1919, one of the select few kept in uniform. His assignment came with a deliberately vague title, Motorization Studies. To foreign inspectors, this meant civilian truck logistics, supply chain efficiency, the boring administrative work of a neutered army. In reality, it meant something else entirely, studying how to build a tank force when tanks were forbidden, developing armor doctrine when armor was banned, preparing for mechanized warfare while pretending to manage mail trucks. The Germans had become experts at this linguistic camouflage during the Versailles negotiations, where every word mattered and clever phrasing could hide entire weapons programs. Guderian's official job was logistics. His actual job was resurrection, and he approached it with the methodical obsession of someone who had seen the future and couldn't unsee it. In the aftermath of defeat, while Germany descended into political chaos and economic collapse, Guderian haunted military libraries. He consumed everything he could find on tank warfare, devouring the works of British theorists who were, ironically, being ignored in their own country. Major General J.F.C. Fuller's Plan 1919 proposed using massed tank formations to paralyze enemy command structures, bypassing strong points entirely. Captain B.H. Liddell Hart argued for the expanding torrent, concentrated armour punching through weak points, then flooding into rear areas before defenders could react. These weren't just tactical papers, they were revolutionary reconceptions of warfare itself, and the British military establishment dismissed them as impractical fantasy. Guderian read them like scripture. He saw what the British couldn't. Their theorists had accidentally invented the answer to trench warfare, but their tradition-bound army couldn't accept it. He began filling notebooks with his own calculations, sketches of tank formations, thoughts on radio coordination, ideas about speed, shock. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from possessing tanks, but it had made one critical error. It said nothing about studying them, thinking about them, or developing theories for their use. While British and French tanks gathered dust in warehouses, their operators trained in outdated doctrine that treated armour as infantry support. Guderian spent the early 1920s at German staff colleges teaching tank tactics for tanks that didn't exist. He organised elaborate wargames using wooden mock-ups mounted on cars, creating mathematical models to calculate theoretical combat outcomes. Officers would fight these cardboard battles on training grounds, with umpires determining who would have won based on Guderian's evolving tactical theories. It looked absurd, grown men playing with fake tanks like children with toys, but it was deadly serious preparation. When the tanks finally came, Germany would have officers who had been thinking about armour warfare for 15 years, who had made their mistakes on training fields rather than battlefields, who had refined their doctrine through hundreds of simulated engagements. Guderian's personal life reflected his single-minded focus. He married Marguerite Gurn in 1913, and she learned to accept a husband whose mind was perpetually elsewhere, lost in calculations of tank speeds and breakthrough depths. They had two sons, Heinz Günther and Kurt, who grew up watching their father cover every available surface with military maps and vehicle specifications. Fellow officers found him intense, difficult, obsessed with his theories to the point of social awkwardness. He had the convert's zealotry, the absolute conviction of someone who had experienced revelation and couldn't understand why others didn't immediately see what he saw. In the small, introspective Reichswehr of the 1920s, where everyone knew everyone and old traditions died hard, Guderian began earning a reputation. Some called him visionary, others called him dangerous, a few, the ones who mattered, called him essential. By the mid-1920s, Guderian had developed the core principles that would define everything to come. Tanks should not support infantry, infantry should support tanks. Armour must be concentrated, not distributed, massed at a single breakthrough point for overwhelming local superiority. Speed and shock matter more than firepower and protection. The enemy's command structure is the real target, not his frontline troops. Paralyze the brain, and the body stops functioning. These ideas contradicted everything the European military establishment believed, challenged assumptions that had governed warfare since Napoleon. To traditional officers, tanks were mobile pillboxes creeping forward at infantry pace to help soldiers cross no man's land. To Guderian, they were something else entirely. The spearhead of a new form of warfare where speed replaced attrition. Where you didn't fight the enemy army, you simply drove past it, collapsing its logistics and command before it could react. He didn't yet have a name for this concept. The world would later call it Blitzkrieg. November 1923, Guderian received orders that would change everything. He was assigned to the Transport Troops Inspectorate, a position that gave him authority over all motorized units in the Reichswehr. To outsiders, this meant managing supply trucks. To those in the know, it meant something far more significant. Guderian now controlled Germany's shadow tank program. He could shape training, influence equipment design, and prepare the organizational structures that would be needed when the tanks finally arrived. He was 35 years old, still relatively junior, but he had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. The lieutenant who had watched tanks at Cambrai was now in position to ensure that when Germany rebuilt its army, armor wouldn't be an afterthought or a support weapon. It would be the tip of the spear. The future he had seen in that muddy trench was about to become doctrine, and doctrine was about to become reality. All he needed now was the tanks themselves, and someone willing to break the rules to get them. April 16th, 1922. In the German Foreign Office in Berlin, diplomats signed a document that would reshape European military history, though none of the witnesses understood what they were actually authorizing. The Treaty of Rapallo established diplomatic and economic ties between Weimar Germany and Soviet Russia, two pariah states, both isolated by the victorious Allies, finding common cause in their mutual resentment. The public clauses dealt with trade agreements and debt forgiveness, tedious financial arrangements that put reporters to sleep. Hidden in separate protocols, locked away in safes, accessible only to select military officers, lay something else entirely: authorization for secret military cooperation. Germany needed training facilities beyond the reach of Allied inspection teams. Soviet Russia needed German technical expertise to modernize its backward military. What they created together was a conspiracy that violated international law, circumvented the Treaty of Versailles, and allowed Germany to develop the weapons that were supposed to ensure peace. Two outcasts had decided that rules were for nations that won wars. The location chosen for Germany's tank school revealed everything about how far from home you needed to go to break international treaties. Kama, a contraction of Kazan and Malaya, sat deep in the Soviet interior, near the city of Kazan on the Kama River, roughly 500 miles east of Moscow. This wasn't a facility you stumbled upon. Getting there required deliberate effort. Rail journey across Poland into Soviet territory, then deeper into Russia to a region most Europeans couldn't find on a map. The climate was brutal summer. Heat that cracked the ground, winter cold that froze, machinery solid, perfect isolation. Allied inspection teams in Germany might suspect treaty violations, but they couldn't prove what was happening in the Soviet heartland. And the Soviets, who viewed Western powers with paranoid hostility, weren't about to invite British or French inspectors to tour their military facilities. Germany and Russia had created a bubble outside the international order, a space where banned weapons could be studied, tested, and perfected without consequence. August 1926, Captain Heinz Guderian stepped off a train in Kazan, breathing air that smelled of distant forests and industrial coal smoke, feeling the particular quality of sunlight that meant you were very far from home. He had volunteered for this assignment, pulled strings to be included among the select officers sent to study at Kama. What he found was both impressive and absurd. A tank training facility equipped with captured, great, war vehicles that were already obsolete, French Renault FTs, their riveted armour pockmarked with rust, British Whippets with failed transmissions, a few Soviet-built tanks that were crude copies of foreign designs. The Germans had maybe 10 actual tanks to work with, plus half a dozen armoured cars. This was the mighty Kama Tank School, the facility that would train the Panzer commanders of the future. A collection of broken-down vehicles on a dusty testing ground in the middle of nowhere. But Guderian understood something crucial. They didn't need the best tanks. They needed to make mistakes now, learn what worked and what didn't, so that when Germany finally built its own armour force, the doctrine would already be perfected. The training at Cambrai was exhaustive and conducted with Germanic thoroughness applied to Soviet-supplied equipment. German officers, never more than 30 at a time, to maintain secrecy-tested tank formations across the rolling steppe, simulated breakthroughs and pursuits, experimented with coordination between armour and infantry. They pushed the old tanks until they broke, learned where mechanical weaknesses appeared under stress, documented fuel consumption rates at different speeds. Every failure was recorded, analysed, incorporated into evolving tactical doctrine. Soviet officers watched with interest, sometimes participating, always learning. This was the bargain. Germany got training facilities beyond Allied reach. Russia got exposure to German military methodology. Both sides benefited, both sides kept the secret. And thousands of miles away, Allied politicians assured their populations that German militarism had been permanently defanged. The Treaty of Versailles was working perfectly, they said. Germany had no tanks, no tank training, no capacity to threaten anyone. Meanwhile, in the Soviet interior, Guderian was literally writing the textbook on armoured warfare. Back in Germany, the deception took different forms, but required equal audacity. Guderian organised elaborate exercises at German training grounds using what he called motor observation units, civilian trucks and cars modified to simulate tank characteristics. Sheet metal frames mounted on automobile chassis created rough tank silhouettes. Tractors were painted and equipped with fake gun barrels, becoming proxy panzers for training purposes. It looked like children playing war, and that was partly the point. When Allied inspection teams arrived to ensure Germany wasn't violating the treaty, they saw agricultural vehicles and commercial trucks conducting logistics exercises. Nothing threatening, nothing military. The inspectors filed reports confirming German compliance, never realizing they were watching the theoretical development of the doctrine that would shatter France in 1940. Guderian conducted entire battles using vehicles that couldn't fire a shot, training commanders to maneuver, concentrate forces, and exploit breakthroughs. Using nothing but imagination and mathematical modelling, the educational component of this shadow program was equally sophisticated. At the Kriegsakademie, the War Academy in Berlin, Guderian began lecturing on tank tactics in the late 1920s, teaching a generation of officers the principles of mobile warfare. His students studied maps showing theoretical breakthrough scenarios, calculated advance rates and fuel consumption, analysed the logistics of high-speed operations. They read Fuller and Liddell Hart, the British theorists whose own military ignored them. Guderian made them memorise the principle of Schwerpunkt, the concentration of overwhelming force at a single decisive point until it became instinctive. He drilled into them that tank formations must never be dispersed to support infantry across a wide front, that armour's power came from concentration and mass. These lectures were theoretical. Germany had no tanks. But Guderian was creating something more dangerous than tanks. He was creating true believers who understood armour warfare at a conceptual level, who had internalized the doctrine so completely that when the tanks finally arrived, implementation would be immediate. The psychological dimension of this secret rearmament is impossible to overstate. Versailles hadn't just limited Germany's military, it had humiliated the officer corps, stripped them of purpose and pride. The shadow tank program restored both. Officers who might have left military service instead found renewed sense of mission, feeling they were preparing for Germany's resurrection. Guderian embodied this perfectly. He worked with fanatical intensity because he believed in eventual vindication, in a future where his theories would be proven on actual battlefields. This wasn't just military planning. It was an act of faith, sustained through the darkest years of the Weimar Republic, when Germany seemed permanently broken. While the country struggled with hyperinflation, political violence, and economic collapse, a select group of officers were quietly ensuring that when stability returned, Germany would have the most advanced armour doctrine in the world. They were preparing for a war they weren't officially allowed to fight, with weapons they weren't officially allowed to possess, against enemies who didn't yet know they should be afraid. The intelligence failure this represented for Britain and France remains staggering even with hindsight. Allied military attachés in Berlin regularly reported on German compliance with Versailles restrictions. They noted Germany's lack of tanks, lack of heavy artillery, lack of military aircraft. Their reports were technically accurate and strategically worthless. They counted weapons but missed doctrine, tracked metal while ignoring ideas. Guderian and his colleagues were developing the theoretical framework for mechanized warfare, testing concepts in war games and limited exercises at Cambrai, creating the organizational structures and command relationships that would make panzer divisions possible. None of this required violating the letter of Versailles in ways that inspectors could document. You can't photograph a doctrine. You can't confiscate an organizational chart. And so Allied intelligence confirmed German weakness while German officers prepared for future strength, hidden in plain sight behind agricultural tractors and theoretical staff college lectures. By 1930, Guderian had emerged as the German army's foremost expert on armour warfare, a specialist in weapons Germany didn't officially possess. His work at Cambrai had given him practical experience with tank operations. His exercises in Germany had refined theoretical doctrine. His lectures had identified and trained a cadre of officers who shared his vision. What he lacked was political support at the highest levels, and here he faced his greatest obstacle. The German military establishment remained dominated by traditionalists, infantry generals who viewed tanks as support weapons, cavalry officers who saw mechanization as an attack on their aristocratic heritage, artillery specialists who believed firepower mattered more than mobility. Guderian's radical vision of independent panzer divisions, of armour as the primary combat arm rather than an auxiliary force, threatened everyone's institutional interests. He needed a political revolution to enable his military one. That revolution was coming, though when it arrived, it would bring complications Guderian couldn't fully anticipate. January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and everything changed. The Nazi regime's arrival meant many things, most of them catastrophic for humanity, but for Guderian's tank program, it meant liberation from Versailles restrictions and unlimited resources for rearmament. Hitler repudiated the treaty openly in 1935, announcing German rearmament to a world that protested weakly and did nothing substantive. Money flowed to tank development. The Cambrai facility could be abandoned because Germany could now openly build armour training grounds at home. Production orders went to German industry, Daimler-Benz, Krupp, MAN companies that had been secretly designing tanks for years under the guise of agricultural tractor development. The conspiracy was over because it no longer needed to be a conspiracy. Guderian had spent more than a decade preparing for this moment, and now he had the political backing and resources to make his vision real. But this support came from a regime whose goals extended far beyond military revitalization, whose plans would ultimately lead to war, genocide, and German destruction. Guderian was about to get everything he wanted, and in getting it, he would become complicit in things no amount of tactical brilliance could justify. February 15th, 1933. Snow fell across the Kummersdorf proving ground south of Berlin as a small convoy of vehicles approached an empty field. Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany for exactly 16 days, stepped from his car to observe something the world wasn't supposed to see: Germany's first prototype tanks. Heinz Guderian, now a colonel, stood waiting in the cold beside 3 vehicles that represented 5 years of covert development. There was a light tractor, literally light tractor, mounting a 37mm gun in a rotating turret. The vehicles looked primitive, which they were, but they represented functional armour design. Sloped plating, independent suspension, enough speed to outpace infantry. Guderian had arranged this demonstration knowing Hitler's enthusiasm for modern weapons, gambling that the new Chancellor would support his radical vision. Behind them stood Wehrmacht generals whose skepticism was almost palpable, cavalry officers in particular viewing this entire display with aristocratic disdain. What happened next would determine whether Guderian's life work became reality or remained theoretical fantasy. The demonstration began, and Guderian narrated, while the prototypes manoeuvred across snow-covered ground. He explained concentration of force, breakthrough operations, exploitation at high speed, the doctrine he'd refined over 15 years. Hitler watched intently, asking questions that showed genuine interest in technical details. The generals watched too, but their body language told a different story. To traditional Wehrmacht officers, these metal boxes represented threat to everything they valued. The cavalry saw mechanization as death of mounted tradition stretching back to Frederick the Great. Infantry generals viewed tanks as support weapons, auxiliaries that would help soldiers cross enemy trenches, definitely not independent formations that would relegate infantry to secondary role. Artillery specialists believed firepower, not mobility, would decide future conflicts. Guderian was proposing to overturn 2 centuries of Prussian military tradition, and tradition fights back. The demonstration ended. Hitler turned to his generals and said something that would echo through the next decade. "That's what I need. Give this man what he needs." In 30 seconds, Hitler had overridden the entire military establishment. Guderian had his political champion. But winning Hitler's support meant fighting the German army itself, and that battle would consume the next 5 years. In the months following the Kummersdorf demonstration, Guderian found himself engaged in bureaucratic warfare as vicious as anything on a battlefield. The army's chief of staff, General Ludwig Beck, opposed creation of independent panzer divisions, arguing for distributing tanks among infantry formations, the classic support weapon role. Cavalry generals proposed replacing horses with armoured vehicles but maintaining traditional cavalry organisation and tactics, missing the entire point. The artillery branch suggested tanks should simply be mobile artillery platforms, protecting the guns that would win battles through firepower. Everyone wanted tanks, but nobody wanted Guderian's doctrine of concentrated, independent armoured formations exploiting breakthroughs at high speed. These weren't just theoretical disagreements. They were existential battles for the soul of the Wehrmacht's future, and Guderian fought them with the same fanatical intensity he brought to everything. The intellectual foundation for Guderian's vision was codified in a manuscript he began circulating privately in 1934, eventually published in 1937 as Achtung, Panzer. Attention, armour. The book opened with devastating critique of Great War tactics. 4 years of attrition, millions dead, vast resources expended to achieve stalemate. This, Guderian argued, was what happened when tactics failed to evolve with technology. Machine guns and artillery had made traditional infantry assault obsolete, but generals kept ordering the same attacks, producing the same casualties, learning nothing. Now, technology had provided the answer: armour, mobility, shock, but military establishments were making the same mistake again, trying to fit tanks into outdated doctrine rather than building new doctrine around tanks. His central thesis was revolutionary. Tanks shouldn't be distributed across the front to help infantry. Infantry should be concentrated behind tank spearheads to exploit the breakthroughs armour would create. The tank was not an auxiliary, it was the primary weapon, and everything else existed to support it. The technical arguments in Achtung, Panzer revealed Guderian's systems thinking approach. He analysed tank warfare as a coordination problem involving 4 separate elements that must function as single organism. First, armour. Concentrated panzer divisions with enough mass to overwhelm any defensive position at the point of crossing. Attack. Second, aviation. Close air support and reconnaissance, providing eyes beyond the horizon and suppressing enemy artillery. Third, motorised infantry. Soldiers in trucks and half-tracks who could keep pace with tanks, providing security and clearing urban areas where armour was vulnerable. Fourth, communications. Radios in every command vehicle, allowing real-time coordination between these elements. Previous armies had possessed some of these capabilities in isolation, but no one had integrated them into unified doctrine. Guderian wasn't proposing better tanks. He was proposing better system where the whole became greater than sum of parts. This required radically different force structure, different training, different command philosophy. It required revolution. The reaction to Achtung, Panzer exposed deep philosophical divide in military thought. Progressive officers, particularly younger ones who had experienced Great War's futility, embraced Guderian's vision as obvious solution to trench warfare's horror. Conservative officers saw dangerous radicalism that threatened military tradition and professional hierarchies. Cavalry commanders viewed mechanization as death of their aristocratic culture. Tanks didn't require generations of equestrian training, didn't reflect noble heritage, reduced warfare to technical problem rather than test of character. Infantry generals worried about losing primacy in force structure and budget. The debate grew heated, sometimes bitter. Guderian earned reputation as difficult, arrogant, unwilling to compromise all true because he believed compromise meant failure. He had seen the future at Cambrai in 1918, spent 15 years developing doctrine to realize that future, and now his own army was trying to water it down into conventional wisdom. He wouldn't allow it, even if it made him enemies throughout the Wehrmacht. The compromise finally reached in October 1935 satisfied no one completely, but gave Guderian enough to proceed. The Wehrmacht would create 3 experimental Panzer divisions, independent formations built around concentrated armour, exactly as Guderian advocated. This was the victory. But most German tanks would still be distributed among infantry divisions as support weapons, and cavalry formations would receive their own armoured vehicles organised in traditional cavalry structure. This was the compromise. Guderian had won, in principle Panzer divisions would exist, but hadn't won institutionally. He would command a Panzer division, but he'd also spend years watching tanks wasted in roles he considered obsolete. The bureaucratic battle wasn't over. It was just entering new phase. And ticking clock in background made everything more urgent, because Hitler's political ambitions were accelerating toward confrontation with Europe, and Guderian's experimental force would be tested in combat before doctrine was perfected or lessons fully learned. The public reception of Achtung Panzer added international dimension to debate. Foreign military attachés in Berlin obtained copies, translated excerpts, sent analyses home to Paris, London, and Washington. The reaction was almost universal dismissal. British intelligence characterized it as typical German aggressive theorizing. French analysts noted Germany's historical tendency toward offensive doctrine that had failed in 1914. American observers considered it interesting but impractical given logistical requirements. The Soviet Union paid more attention. They were developing their own deep operations doctrine that paralleled Guderian's thinking, but Stalin's purges in 1937 through 39 would kill most Red Army, theorists and tank commanders. Only the Wehrmacht took Guderian seriously, and even they were divided. Foreign intelligence failures here were catastrophic. They had the doctrine, could read the blueprint for their own defeat, but dismissed it as propaganda or unrealistic fantasy. When German panzers exploded through Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, Allied commanders would claim to be shocked by a new form of warfare. But there was no mystery. Guderian had published the instruction manual 4 years earlier. The personal cost of Guderian's crusade rarely appears in military histories, but shaped everything he did. His single-minded focus on armour doctrine damaged relationships with fellow officers who felt he was arrogant and unwilling to consider alternative viewpoints. His marriage to Marguerite survived, but was strained by a husband who brought work obsession home constantly, who turned every social gathering into forum for arguing about tank tactics, who couldn't separate professional identity from personal life. His sons grew up with distant father, whose real passion was doctrine development. Guderian had hitched everything, career, reputation, relationships to success of his armour theory. If it failed in actual combat, he would be discredited. If it succeeded, he would be vindicated, but forever associated with regime whose political goals he increasingly realised were not just military restoration. The Faustian bargain was complete. He had everything he needed to prove his theories. All it would cost was complicity in Nazi Germany's wars of conquest. By late 1937, the theoretical phase was ending and the practical phase beginning. Guderian was appointed commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, giving him direct control of actual combat formation built to his specifications. The division had 2 panzer regiments, about 300 tanks plus, motorised infantry brigade, reconnaissance battalion, artillery regiment, and support units. This was the laboratory where theory would become practice, where Guderian could test every aspect of his doctrine with real soldiers and real equipment. Training exercises in 1937 and 1938 pushed the division to its limits. Long-distance road marches, testing mechanical reliability, live fire exercises, coordinating armour and infantry, radio communication drills ensuring every commander could talk to every other Foreign military observers watched these maneuvers and filed reports noting German speed and coordination, but they still didn't understand what they were seeing. They were watching rehearsal for conquest, but they thought it was just training. The curtain was about to rise on the actual performance, and the audience wasn't prepared for the show they were about to witness. March 7th, 1936. German soldiers marched across the Rhine River bridges into the Rhineland territory that Versailles had declared permanently demilitarized. This was naked treaty violation, Germany's first direct challenge to post-war international order. The world held its breath. France mobilized reserves but didn't intervene. Britain protested, diplomatically but took no action. Adolf Hitler had gambled that Western powers wouldn't enforce their own treaty, and he was right. In the Bendler Block Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin, officers who had opposed the operation as recklessly provocative watched in stunned silence as their Führer's intuition proved correct. Among them was Heinz Guderian, now a general, watching political calculation transform military capability. The Rhineland occupation succeeded not through military force, but through Allied paralysis. Hitler had learned something dangerous. The victors of the Great War lacked will to defend the peace they'd created. And for Guderian's armour programme, this meant constraint had been lifted. Germany could now rearm openly, massively, without consequence. The shadow development phase was over. Mass production could begin. The relationship between Guderian and Hitler was professional symbiosis built on mutual need and mutual exploitation, and understanding it essential to understanding everything that followed. Hitler needed Guderian's technical expertise, his ability to translate aggressive strategic vision into operational reality. The Führer had instinct for political audacity but limited military knowledge. He needed professional soldiers who could build the Wehrmacht into instrument of national expansion. Guderian needed Hitler's political authority, his willingness to override conservative generals and allocate unlimited resources to armour development. The traditional Wehrmacht establishment would never have fully embraced panzer divisions without political pressure from the top. Each man gave the other what he lacked. This partnership would achieve stunning military success and would also tie Guderian indissolubly to Nazi regime's war crimes. You cannot separate the tactical brilliance from the strategic monstrosity it enabled. The scale of German rearmament between 1933 and 1939 remains staggering, even viewed through historical distance. When Hitler took power, the Reichswehr numbered exactly 100,000 men, possessed no tanks, and operated under permanent Allied supervision. 6 years later, the Wehrmacht fielded 1.5 million soldiers organised in 103 divisions, including 6 panzer divisions and 4 motorised divisions. Tank production exploded from 0 to more than 3,000 vehicles. Aircraft production grew from nothing to 2,700 combat aircraft. Defence spending increased from 700 million Reichsmarks in 1933 to 17 billion Reichsmarks in 1938, roughly 30% of entire government budget. Germany was transforming itself into a war machine at pace unprecedented in peacetime history, and Guderian rode this rearmament wave, rising from colonel to general in 5 years, finally receiving resources to realise every element of his doctrine. The cost was complicity. Every tank built brought Germany closer to war. Every officer trained in armour tactics prepared for conquest. Guderian knew this. He proceeded anyway. October 1935 marked Guderian's ascension to formal command authority over Germany's armour programme. He was appointed Chief of Mobile Troops, position created specifically to oversee development of panzer and motorised forces. This gave him influence over training, doctrine, equipment, procurement, and organisational structure across entire Wehrmacht. It also placed him at centre of continuing bureaucratic battles with conservative generals who still resisted independent panzer divisions. General Ludwig Beck, Chief of the General Staff, remained Guderian's primary opponent not from reactionary traditionalism but from strategic conservatism. Beck believed Germany wasn't ready for war, that rapid rearmament was producing quantity without quality, that Hitler's aggressive foreign policy would provoke conflict before Wehrmacht was prepared. Guderian disagreed on tactics, but would eventually be proved wrong on strategy. Beck was right, Germany would go to war too soon, with inadequate preparation, and would lose catastrophically. But in 1935, Beck's caution looked like timidity, and Guderian's aggression looked like vision. Wehrmacht maneuvers in autumn 1937 provided first full-scale demonstration of Panzer Division in action, and foreign military observers missed the significance completely. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Division conducted breakthrough exercise in Mecklenburg, achieving 40-mile penetration in 8 hours against defending infantry formations. His units maintained radio communication throughout, coordinated with supporting aviation, exploited breakthrough without pausing for infantry to catch up. The exercise umpires declared the operation unrealistically successful. Real combat would involve more resistance, they said. Guderian's response was prophetic. You're judging by Great War standards. Modern warfare will be faster. French and British attachés filed reports noting German emphasis on mobility and speed, but characterized it as interesting experimentation rather than fundamental revolution in warfare. Soviet observers paid closer attention. They were developing parallel doctrine called deep operations that shared Guderian's emphasis on breakthrough and exploitation. But Stalin's military purges, beginning in mid-1937, would eliminate most Red Army theorists and tank commanders, decapitating Soviet armor doctrine just as it matured. Germany's most dangerous potential opponent was destroying its own military leadership. Hitler's timing was perfect, though he hadn't planned it. The moral dimension of Guderian's service under Hitler remains an uncomfortable subject, usually handled in military histories through euphemism or omission. Guderian was not Nazi ideologue. He didn't join the Nazi Party until 1938, and then only under pressure after Hitler purged conservative generals who opposed his war plans. Guderian's letters and diaries show man primarily interested in professional military questions, not political ideology. But this political disengagement was itself a form of moral failure. By 1938, Nazi regime's nature was evident to anyone willing to see. The Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of citizenship, concentration camps held political prisoners, aggressive foreign policy threatened European peace. Guderian's response was to focus on tanks. He treated moral questions as distractions from military professionalism, drew artificial line between tactical effectiveness and strategic purpose. This was self-deception. The panzer force he was building had no defensive purpose. Everything about it was designed for aggressive warfare. He was creating weapon of conquest for a regime whose conquest goals extended to racial domination and genocide. Claiming to be a political soldier while enabling political catastrophe was not neutrality, it was choice. February 1938 brought crisis that exposed Wehrmacht's political subordination to Nazi Party. Hitler summoned senior generals to Berghof, his mountain retreat, and announced intention to annex Austria and dismember Czechoslovakia within the year. Several generals objected. General Werner von Fritsch, commander-in-chief of the army, argued Wehrmacht wasn't ready for war. General Beck opposed Hitler's timeline as recklessly aggressive. Hitler's response was ruthless. Within weeks, Fritsch was forced to resign on fabricated charges of homosexuality. Beck was marginalized and would resign later that year. 16 generals were dismissed or reassigned in wholesale purge. The message to Wehrmacht Officer Corps was unmistakable. Oppose Hitler's plans and your career ends. Guderian watched these purges, said nothing, benefited from them. His position strengthened as conservative. Opponents were eliminated. He was promoted to command XVI Corps, giving him operational control over multiple panzer and motorized divisions. His silence during the purge was pragmatic. Speaking up would have ended his career without saving the dismissed generals. But silence in the face of injustice is participation. Guderian's great failure wasn't tactical, it was moral. He could see armoured warfare's future, but couldn't or wouldn't see where Germany was headed politically. The equipment rolling off German production lines by 1938 exposed another dimension of Guderian's gamble. He had convinced Hitler to approve panzer divisions, secured massive funding for tank production, created organisational structures for mechanized warfare. But the tanks themselves remained mediocre. The Panzer I mounted only machine guns, essentially training vehicle pressed into combat role. The Panzer II had 20mm autocannon inadequate against armour. Even the Panzer III and IV, designed as main battle tanks, were undergunned and thinly armoured compared to French and British equivalents. French Char B1 heavy tank had 60mm armor and 75mm gun, superior to any German tank in every measurable category. British Matilda II, infantry tank 78mm armor, was essentially invulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Guderian knew this. His genius was recognizing that tank-for-tank quality mattered less than system integration. One excellent tank poorly coordinated was worth less than 5 mediocre tanks working together with air support and motorized infantry. But this was gamble. If his doctrine didn't work, German technical inferiority would be exposed catastrophically. By summer 1939, Guderian commanded XIM's Corps 3 divisions, including 3rd Panzer Division, 2nd Motorized Division, and 20th Motorized Division. This was the instrument he'd spent 20 years conceptualizing and 5 years building. Approximately 800 tanks supported by motorized infantry with integrated air support and radio coordination. The Corps was stationed in East Prussia, facing Poland, and even officers not privy to high-level planning could read the strategic implications. Hitler had spent the year manufacturing diplomatic crisis over Danzig and the Polish corridor, making demands he knew Poland couldn't accept. Wehrmacht mobilization was underway. War was coming. Guderian's experimental doctrine would soon face its first real test. Everything he'd theorized, wargamed, and trained for would be validated or disproved on actual battlefield against actual enemy. If his doctrine failed, he would be discredited, and Germany's armor program would be restructured along traditional lines. If it succeeded, warfare would be transformed. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The man who had seen the future at Cambrai in 1918 was about to discover whether the future he'd spent 2 decades building would actually work. September 1934. Inside a Daimler-Benz factory in Stuttgart, engineers gathered around what looked like steel coffin on tracks. The Panzer I prototype sat under harsh industrial lighting, its riveted hull gleaming with fresh paint, crew compartment barely large enough for 2 men. Chief designer Josef Vollmer walked around the vehicle with visible dissatisfaction. This wasn't what the German army needed, and everyone in the room knew it. The Panzer I weighed just 5.5 tons, mounted 2 7.92mm machine guns in a small turret, and had maximum armor thickness of 13mm, barely enough to stop rifle bullets, useless against anti-tank weapons. It was trainee built because Versailles treaty restrictions had prevented actual tank development until 1933, and Germany needed something to build immediately. But Heinz Guderian, observing the presentation, saw different calculation. Perfect tank couldn't be built quickly. Good enough tank could. And while engineers perfected better designs, soldiers could learn on these primitive vehicles. Speed of deployment mattered more than technical perfection. The factory could build 100 Panzers in the time it took to perfect one superior design. Mass production would create trained crews, identify mechanical problems, and establish supply chains. The Panzer I was admission of current weakness and investment in future strength. The technical limitations of early German tanks were comprehensive and would nearly prove catastrophic in actual combat. Panzer I, 5.4 tons, crew of 2, 2 machine guns, maximum speed 25 miles per hour, armour 13mm on turret, maximum operational range 90 miles. This was reconnaissance vehicle being sold as combat tank. Panzer II, introduced in 1936, improved situation marginally. 9 tons, crew of 3, 20mm. Autocannon, armour up to 30mm, speed 25 miles per hour. Better, but still inadequate against any serious opposition. The Panzer III, intended as main battle tank, entered production in 1937, 20 tons, crew of 5. Initially mounting 37mm gun that would later be upgraded to 50mm, armour 30mm, speed 25 miles per hour. The Panzer IV, designed as infantry support vehicle, appeared simultaneously, 20 tons, crew of 5, short-barreled 75mm gun for high explosive shells, armour 30mm, speed 23 miles per hour. These were the tanks that would invade Poland and France. None was technologically impressive. Most were vulnerable to contemporary anti-tank weapons. The German advantage wouldn't come from tank quality, it would come from how tanks were used. The production numbers tell story of frantic race against time and strategic uncertainty. In 1934, Germany built exactly 0 tanks. Versailles restrictions were still nominally in effect. In 1935, after Hitler's open repudiation of the treaty, production began. 815 tanks, mostly Panzers. 1936, 1,100 tanks. 1937, 890. 1938, 1,458. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Wehrmacht possessed approximately 3,200 tanks, but composition was problematic. 1,445 Panzer is machine guns only, 1,226 Panzer IIs, light gun 98 Panzer IIIs, 211 Panzer IVs, plus assorted command tanks and captured Czech vehicles. Germany was going to war with tank force. That was 70% light armour unsuitable for sustained combat against fortified positions or heavy enemy tanks. Guderian knew this. His doctrine had to overcome this limitation through superior tactics, or his entire vision would collapse in first serious engagement. February 1937. At Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, Guderian watched a competitive trial that would haunt German armour development for years. On one side of the field, German Panzer III prototype. On the other, captured French Char B1 heavy tank. The specifications were humiliating to German engineers. Char B1, 32 tons, crew of 4, 60mm armour on hull, 75mm howitzer in hull, plus 47mm gun in turret, maximum speed 17 miles per hour. It was slow, mechanically complex, and operationally difficult to command because the commander also served as gunner. But it was nearly impervious to German anti-tank guns, and its armament could destroy any German tank at ranges beyond German guns' effective distance. Test firing demonstrated the asymmetry brutally. Panzer III's 37mm gun bounced rounds off the Char B1's armour at 500 metres. The French 75mm gun penetrated Panzer III's armour at 1,000 metres. One French tank could theoretically destroy 5 or 6 German tanks before being disabled. The math was devastating. Guderian's response would define everything that followed. We don't need the best tank. We need 1,000 tanks that work together. This decision to accept technical inferiority in exchange for numerical superiority and tactical coordination was simultaneously brilliant and nearly catastrophic. Guderian understood that building perfect tank would take years and would produce small numbers. Building good enough tanks immediately would create mass. And mass, properly coordinated, could overcome quality. But this doctrine required German tanks to avoid fighting enemy armour on equal terms. They had to achieve surprise, concentrate overwhelming local superiority, or bypass strong points entirely. The moment Panzer Division got stuck in grinding battle of attrition against well-prepared enemy with superior tanks, Guderian's entire system would fail. He was building operational doctrine around technological weakness, gambling that speed and coordination could permanently prevent the kind of direct confrontation where German technical inferiority would be exposed. This was tightrope walk. One misstep, one battle where French or British tanks could fight German armour on even terms would shatter the illusion. The radio revolution in German armour doctrine rarely receives attention it deserves, but it was as important as the tanks themselves. Every German tank company commander had radio in 1939. This was unprecedented. French tanks used coloured flags for signalling between vehicles, with company commanders physically looking around battlefield to assess situation. British tanks had radio sets in command vehicles only, with most tanks receiving orders through visual signals or messengers. Soviet tanks had virtually no radio communications at company level. German system meant every platoon leader could talk to every other platoon leader, company commander could coordinate 5 tanks in real time, battalion commander could shift entire company to exploit unexpected opportunity within minutes. This speed of communication created tempo advantage that multiplied combat effectiveness. A German panzer company with radio could react to changing circumstances 3 or 4 times faster than Allied tank company using flags and runners. In fluid battle, This meant German forces consistently arrived at critical points, minutes or hours, before Allied forces even understood what was happening. The radio didn't make German tanks better. It made German tank formations incomparably more effective as coordinated system. Industrial production capacity became strategic constraint that Wehrmacht never fully solved. German economy in 1930s was large but not overwhelming, roughly equivalent to Britain or France individually, substantially smaller than combined Allied production capacity, minuscule compared to United States. Tank production required steel, machinery, skilled labour, and factory space that competed with aircraft production, shipbuilding, small arms, and countless other military programs. Hitler's rearmament was broadly based but not particularly deep. Germany built enough weapons to fight short, decisive campaigns, but lacked industrial capacity for sustained multi-year war of attrition. Guderian's Blitzkrieg doctrine wasn't just operational preference, it was strategic necessity. Germany couldn't win long war. Had to win fast, using existing equipment, before industrial advantage shifted to enemies. This created vicious circle. Tactical doctrine required quick victories to succeed. But quick victories were necessary because industrial base couldn't sustain extended conflict. Any campaign that lasted more than months would expose German weakness. Wehrmacht was racing against its own logistics, and the clock started ticking the moment first shot was fired. The human dimension of tank crew training deserves attention because it reveals much about how German tactical advantages were created. Panzer crew members trained for months before deploying to combat units. Driver training emphasized mechanical understanding. Every driver learned to perform field maintenance, change tracks, repair engine problems. Gunners trained on moving ranges, learning to hit targets while vehicle was in motion, a skill Allied crews often lacked. Commanders attended week-long courses on radio procedure, map reading, and combined arms coordination. This produced crews that could maintain their tanks under field conditions, hit targets while moving, and coordinate with supporting units. French and Polish tankers often had better vehicles but worse training. French tank doctrine emphasized slow, deliberate movement in support of infantry. They didn't train for rapid maneuver or mechanical self-sufficiency. Polish tankers were brave but operating obsolete equipment with minimal training time. Soviet tank crews in 1939 were poorly trained after purges eliminated experienced officers. German training advantage would prove as important as radio communications in early war campaigns. Superior tactics and training can overcome technical inferiority for limited time, until attrition eliminates skilled crews faster than training pipeline can replace them. By summer 1939, Guderian's tank force existed in strange position of confident doctrine built on mediocre equipment. The organizational structure was revolutionary. Panzer divisions with integrated armor, motorized infantry, reconnaissance, artillery, engineers, all trained to operate as unified force. The communications were revolutionary. Real-time radio coordination enabling tempo impossible for opponents. The doctrine was revolutionary. Concentration, breakthrough, exploitation at high speed. But the tanks themselves were second-rate. German armor in 1939 was qualitatively inferior to French tanks, roughly equivalent to British tanks, superior only to Polish and Soviet equipment. This asymmetry, cutting-edge doctrine with obsolete equipment created fundamental vulnerability. If Guderian's tactics worked, German technical weakness wouldn't matter. If they failed, Wehrmacht would face catastrophic defeats against enemies with superior armor. Everything depended on operational execution. The theory would soon meet reality. And reality, as always, was unforgiving to theoretical constructs that contained hidden flaws. November 4th, 1936. The cargo ship Encirclement docked at Seville harbour in southern Spain, and German soldiers began unloading crates marked as agricultural machinery. Inside were 41 Panzer I tanks, the first armour commitment of the Condor Legion, Germany's secret expeditionary force supporting nationalist rebels in Spain's civil war. Major Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma supervised the unloading, watching Spanish nationalist officers examine the small tanks with visible disappointment. They had expected wonder weapons, German technology that would crush Republican resistance. What they got were 5-ton vehicles with machine guns, thin armour, and crews who had trained for exactly 3 months. Von Thoma understood their disappointment, but also understood something they didn't. Spain wasn't about winning Spanish Civil War. Spain was Germany's live-fire laboratory, a place to test doctrine and equipment under combat conditions while the world was distracted by ideological conflict between fascism and communism. Every tank destroyed in Spain was lesson learned before the real war began. Every tactical failure here prevented strategic catastrophe later. The Spanish proving ground was worth more than victory. It was worth knowledge. The Condor Legion's tank deployment was deliberately limited, maintaining plausible deniability of German intervention while providing sufficient force to generate meaningful combat data. Between November 1936 and March 1939, Germany deployed approximately 180 Panzer I tanks to Spain, organised in company-sized units operating alongside nationalist forces. These weren't the experimental panzer divisions Guderian envisioned. Spanish terrain and political constraints prevented that. Instead, German tanks fought as infantry support in traditional role, exactly the doctrine Guderian opposed. This created an ironic situation. Germany's armour-proving ground tested the wrong doctrine. But even wrong doctrine under fire revealed critical, technical, and tactical lessons. The tanks themselves performed poorly against prepared positions. Republican forces, equipped with Soviet anti-tank rifles and artillery, found the panzerized 13mm armour laughably inadequate. First major tank engagement at Esquivias in October 1936 saw German tanks suffer 40% casualties attacking fortified village. Crews reported that armour protection was like cardboard against anything larger than rifle bullets. October 22, 1937. The Battle of Fuentes de Ebro demonstrated both the promise and limitation of armour warfare in ways that would echo through next decade. Nationalist forces, including German Tank Company under von Thoma's command, attacked Republican positions east of Zaragoza. The plan was simple. Tanks would charge across open ground, break through enemy lines. Infantry would follow. It was Great War tactics with Great War results. 48 tanks advanced without artillery preparation, without infantry support, without reconnaissance of enemy positions. Republican defenders, many of them, international brigade volunteers with anti-tank. Training waited until German tanks closed to 300 metres, then opened fire with Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns and anti-tank rifles. The carnage was immediate. 20 tanks were destroyed or disabled in first 30 minutes. Crews that survived initial barrage found themselves immobilised by mechanical failures, sitting targets for Republican artillery. Von Thoma called off the attack after losing nearly half his armour for zero territorial gain. The after-action report sent to Berlin was devastating. Tanks cannot attack prepared positions without combined armed support. Armour alone is vulnerable. Infantry alone is ineffective. Integration is essential. But Spain also demonstrated the terrifying potential of proper combined arms coordination. In March 1938, during the Aragon offensive, German forces conducted operation that previewed Blitzkrieg tactics. Small tank unit coordinated with Luftwaffe Junkers Ju 87 Stuka dive bombers, attacking Republican positions near Belchite. The sequence revealed Guderian's vision in miniature. Stukas bombed enemy strongpoints for 30 minutes, suppressing anti-tank guns and shattering defensive coordination. Immediately following air attack, German tanks advanced at maximum speed, bypassing fortified positions and driving into Republican rear areas before defenders recovered. Motorized infantry followed in trucks, clearing bypass strongpoints while tanks continued forward. In 6 hours, the combined force advanced 15 miles and captured 2,000 prisoners, exceptional performance by Spanish Civil War standards, modest by standards of what was coming. Guderian received detailed reports of this engagement and recognized it as validation of his theories. The lesson was clear. Armour plus aviation plus infantry, coordinated by radio and executing at high tempo, could achieve breakthrough that each element alone could not. System integration multiplied combat power exponentially. The technical lessons from Spain transformed German tank development in critical ways. Armour thickness became immediate priority after Spanish casualties demonstrated vulnerability. 1938 production tanks received upgraded armour. Panzer III increased from 15mm to 30mm. Panzer IV received similar improvements. Gun caliber debates shifted. Spanish experience showed 37mm gun on Panzer III was barely adequate, leading to development of 50mm gun that would be retrofitted to existing tanks. Mechanical reliability emerged as unexpected problem. Spanish roads and terrain were far better than Soviet Union or Poland would offer, yet tanks broke down constantly. Engines overheated. Transmissions failed. Track pins sheared. Spanish combat demonstrated that Panzer I and II were essentially unfit for sustained operations, accelerating development of Panzer III and IV as true battle tanks. Every mechanical failure in Spain was a problem that wouldn't appear for first time in actual war against serious opponent. The testing ground was fulfilling its purpose, revealing weaknesses, while stakes were still relatively low. The Soviet response to German tactics in Spain deserves attention because it shows how close another nation came to developing parallel doctrine. Soviet Union supplied Republican forces with tanks, aircraft, and advisors, creating a situation where German and Soviet military observers watched each other test equipment and tactics. Soviet theorists had independently developed deep operations doctrine in early 1930s, concept remarkably similar to Guderian's Blitzkrieg, emphasizing breakthrough, exploitation, and paralysis of enemy command. Soviet officers in Spain saw German combined arms coordination and recognized theoretical concepts becoming operational reality. They sent detailed reports to Moscow analyzing German tactics, recommending Soviet forces adopt similar integration of armor, aviation, and motorized infantry. These reports arrived in 1937 and 38, exactly when Stalin's Great Purge was decimating Red Army officer corps. Most theorists who had developed deep operations doctrine were executed as alleged traitors. Combat experienced tank commanders from Spain returned to Soviet Union and were promptly arrested. The knowledge was there. The institutional capacity to implement it was systematically destroyed by a paranoid dictator. Germany's most dangerous potential opponent was learning right lessons but killing the teachers. International Brigade volunteers fighting for Spanish Republic faced German tanks and carried that experience home to Britain, France, and America, but their warnings were largely dismissed. George Orwell, serving in Aragon Front, described German tank attack in Homage to Catalonia. The speed was shocking. One moment, the horizon was empty. Next moment, tanks were 400 yards away, then they were on top of you. British volunteer Jason Gurney wrote detailed memo to War Office describing German combined arms tactics, emphasis on speed and radio coordination. War Office filed the report and took no action. French veterans provided similar testimony to French Army intelligence. The response was institutional skepticism. These were political radicals. Their military observations were considered unreliable. And besides, Spanish Civil War was seen as low-intensity conflict that didn't reflect modern warfare between major powers. Allied intelligence had eyewitness accounts of German tactical revolution and dismissed them as exaggeration or propaganda. This was catastrophic analytical failure. The data was available, interpretation was flawed. Wehrmacht was conducting public rehearsal of tactics they would use in Poland and France, and potential victims were watching without comprehending. The aviation armor coordination tested in Spain became foundational element of Blitzkrieg doctrine. Luftwaffe deployed Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers to Spain in 1937, and German commanders quickly developed procedures for close air support that would be refined but not fundamentally changed in the next 5 years. The process was straightforward but required extensive training. Forward observers with tank units identified targets and radioed coordinates to air liaison officer, who contacted Luftwaffe liaison at division headquarters, who vectored available aircraft to target. In Spain, this process took 30 to 40 minutes from identification to bombs on target, slow by later standards but revolutionary compared to Allied procedures, which had no comparable system. The psychological effect of Stuka attacks was as important as physical damage. The Ju-87 sirens created terror out of proportion to actual destructive capacity. Republican soldiers learned to fear the distinctive scream preceding attack, causing defensive lines to collapse before tanks even arrived. German observers noted this psychological dimension and incorporated it into doctrine. Aviation's role wasn't just destruction but demoralization, breaking enemy will to resist before ground forces made contact. By early 1939, as Spanish Civil War wound to nationalist victory, Condor Legion tank units rotated back to Germany carrying combat experience that transformed Wehrmacht armor force. Approximately 150 German tank officers and crew members had fought in Spain, making them only Germans with actual combat experience in armored warfare. These veterans became instructors at German tank schools, bringing lessons written in Spanish blood. Their after-action presentations emphasized several consistent themes. Armor cannot operate alone, combined arms coordination is non-negotiable, radio communication is life or death critical, mechanical reliability matters as much as firepower. Tank versus tank. Combat should be avoided in favor of bypassing enemy armor. These weren't theoretical principles anymore. They were survival lessons from men who had watched comrades burn in disabled tanks, who had experienced anti-tank ambushes, who understood viscerally that doctrine determines whether you live or die. Guderian absorbed these lessons, modified training programs, adjusted tactical manuals. Spain had validated his core theories while revealing implementation problems. The laboratory had done its work. Germany's armor force was as ready as it would ever be. The question was whether opponents had learned anything from watching German rehearsal, or whether they would enter real war as unprepared as Republican forces had been in Spain. March 12, 1938. 4:30 in the morning. The German-Austrian border at Passau sat in darkness as Heinz Guderian's 6 Wiens Corps began crossing into Austria. This was Anschluss, the annexation, presented to world as peaceful unification of German peoples. Guderian commanded the armoured spearhead, 2nd Panzer Division, SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, support units, roughly 500 tanks and armoured vehicles beginning 400-mile road march to Vienna. The planning assumed unopposed entry, enthusiastic reception, propaganda triumph. First tank broke down before leaving German territory. By dawn, the column stretched 50 miles back into Germany, with disabled vehicles creating traffic jams that turned military operation into logistical nightmare. Guderian, riding in command car near front of column, received increasingly frantic radio reports. Tanks overheating, transmissions failing, tracks breaking. By noon, approximately 150 of 500 tanks were disabled, being towed by trucks or simply abandoned beside road. Austrian civilians lined routes waving flowers and Nazi flags, cheering German soldiers who were frantically performing field repairs on broken-down Panzers. It was propaganda success and operational catastrophe simultaneously. Guderian had just learned that his armour force couldn't even drive to Vienna without falling apart, and he was supposed to be ready for war. The mechanical failures during Anschluss exposed fundamental problems that German industry had papered over through limited testing. Maybach HL engines used in Panzer III and IV were prone to overheating during sustained high-speed operation on paved roads. Designers had tested tanks on dirt training grounds at moderate speeds, conditions that didn't replicate 400-mile road march at maximum velocity. The final drive systems components transferring power from transmission to tracks were under-engineered, adequate for short-distance operations but failing under sustained stress. Track pins, small metal components holding individual track links together, sheared under continuous use on hard pavement. These weren't exotic technical problems. They were basic mechanical engineering failures that should have been caught during development but weren't because testing had been inadequate. Guderian's fury was comprehensive. He understood immediately that if tanks couldn't survive unopposed march through friendly territory, they certainly couldn't survive approach march followed by actual combat. The Austrian embarrassment was blessing in disguise. Better to discover these problems now than during real war. March 15th, 1938, Vienna. Hitler demanded military parade through Austrian capital, showcase of German military power for newsreels and newspapers. Wehrmacht staff faced disaster. Half the tanks that started journey were broken down somewhere between German border and Vienna. Maintenance crews were scattered across Austria performing repairs. Spare parts were critically short. The night before parade, every available mechanic worked frantically, cannibalizing disabled tanks for parts to repair vehicles that would actually appear in Vienna. They managed to assemble roughly 300 operational tanks, enough for impressive parade, but only 60% of what had crossed border 3 days earlier. Hitler stood in reviewing stand, watching panzers roll past, beaming at cheering crowds, completely unaware that his military had just experienced near-catastrophic equipment failure. Guderian stood nearby. Uniform, immaculate, expression carefully neutral, mind calculating how many months of mechanical overhaul would be needed before his corps was genuinely combat ready. The gap between propaganda image and operational reality had never been wider. The after-action analysis Guderian demanded from his division commanders pulled no punches. 2nd Panzer Division reported 38% of vehicles disabled during approach march, with engine problems accounting for 40% of failures, transmission issues 30%, track and suspension problems 30%, average repair time for major mechanical failure 4 to 6 hours, assuming spare parts available. Time required to tow disabled tank to repair facility 2 to 4 hours. Logistical finding. Maintenance companies couldn't keep pace with advancing combat units, creating gap where disabled vehicles sat unrepaired for days. Strategic conclusion. Current mechanical reliability was inadequate for sustained operations. Tactical conclusion. Every operation must plan for 30 to 40% vehicle loss to mechanical failure before contact with enemy. Guderian read these reports with growing anger, not at his subordinates who were accurately describing problems, but at industrial planners and procurement officers who had rushed tanks into production without adequate testing. He initiated emergency mechanical overhaul program. Every tank would undergo complete mechanical inspection and replacement of questionable components. This would take months and delay training. It was unavoidable. Better delayed training than catastrophic failure in actual combat. March 15th, 1939, exactly 1 year after Austrian annexation, German forces occupied Czechoslovakia, and Guderian's mechanized units again provided armoured spearhead. Wehrmacht had spent intervening year addressing mechanical problems exposed during Anschluss. Engines had been reinforced, transmissions upgraded, track systems improved. The Czech occupation would test whether improvements actually worked. Results were better, but not perfect. Approximately 25% vehicle breakdown rate compared to 38% in Austria. Improvement, yes, but still unacceptably high. Guderian's formations reached Prague without incident, but once again, maintenance crews spent days recovering broken down vehicles scattered across Bohemia and Moravia. However, Czech occupation provided unexpected strategic windfall that partially compensated for mechanical disappointments. Czechoslovakia possessed substantial domestic arms industry, including CKD and Škoda factories producing excellent tank designs. Germany immediately seized 469 Czech LT-35 and LT-38 tanks, redesignating them Panzer 35T and 38T. The Czech tanks were more reliable than German designs, better engineered, with superior suspensions and transmissions. Wehrmacht would use captured Czech tanks extensively in Poland and France campaigns. Conquest of Czechoslovakia handed Germany several panzer battalions worth of equipment that was actually superior to domestic production. The political dimension of these bloodless conquests obscured their military significance, creating dangerous strategic miscalculation by Germany's potential enemies. Britain and France watched German absorption of Austria and Czechoslovakia with impotent anger, but took comfort in one fact: no shots fired meant German military capabilities remained unproven. British and French intelligence noted German mechanical problems, reports of broken down tanks were hard to miss, and concluded Wehrmacht was unready for serious combat. This analysis was simultaneously accurate and catastrophic. Yes, German army had mechanical reliability problems. Yes, operational readiness was questionable. But Wehrmacht was identifying and fixing these problems through real-world testing, while British and French forces conducted theoretical exercises. German tanks broke down during unopposed occupations, mechanics learned repair procedures, logistics officers refined supply chains, an entire force became progressively more capable. Meanwhile, French and British forces, certain their equipment was superior, which it was felt no urgency to test it under comparable conditions. They would discover their own mechanical problems during actual combat, when there was no time to fix them. German military was learning. Allied militaries were complacent. The international response to German expansionism in 1938 and 39 remains one of history's great strategic failures. Britain and France had overwhelming combined military superiority over Germany in 1938. French army alone fielded nearly 3,000 tanks, many superior to German equivalents. Britain possessed world's most powerful navy and empire's resources. Combined Allied military production capacity exceeded Germany's by a substantial margin, yet they allowed Hitler to dismantle Versailles settlement piece by piece without military response. Munich Agreement in September 1938, where Britain and France forced Czechoslovakia to cede Sudetenland to Germany, represented peak of appeasement policy. Conventional historical judgment condemns British and French leaders as weak or foolish. Reality was more complex. Memories of Great War's slaughter made public opinion violently opposed to another conflict. Economic depression had limited military spending. Both nations were diplomatically isolated and couldn't count on American support. But consequences of appeasement were catastrophic. Every unopposed German action emboldened Hitler, validated his intuition that Western democracies wouldn't fight, and bought Wehrmacht additional time to address mechanical and organizational problems. By September 1939, when Britain and France finally drew line over Poland, German military readiness had improved substantially from 1938 levels, while Allied readiness had stagnated. Guderian spent the year between Czech occupation and Polish invasion driving his formations mercilessly, determined that mechanical embarrassments of Austria and Czechoslovakia wouldn't be repeated under combat conditions. Training exercises increased in length and intensity. Road marches of 100 miles became routine, then 200 miles, testing vehicles to destruction and beyond. Maintenance crews trained to perform repairs under field conditions, without workshop facilities or unlimited spare parts. Radio communications drills emphasized sustaining contact during rapid movement, coordinating dispersed units across wide frontages. Tank gunnery training shifted emphasis from stationary to moving targets, preparing for fluid meeting engagements rather than static warfare. Combined arms exercises integrated armor, infantry, artillery, and aviation in increasingly complex scenarios. By summer 1939, XIX Corps that Guderian commanded was as ready as any military formation could be for mechanized warfare. They had trained harder than any comparable Allied unit. Their officers understood combined arms doctrine at instinctive level. Their equipment, while not technically superior, was now mechanically reliable for sustained operations. Most importantly, they had institutional culture that emphasized initiative, adaptation, and aggressive exploitation of opportunity. They were about to demonstrate what prepared military force could achieve against unprepared opponent, and demonstration would shock the world. The Czech occupation yielded one final strategic advantage that rarely appears in standard histories but mattered enormously in coming campaigns. Intelligence windfall from captured Czech military records and interrogation of Czech general staff officers. Czechoslovakia had maintained extensive intelligence apparatus focused on German military, compiled detailed assessments of Wehrmacht organization, equipment, and doctrine. German intelligence officers seized these files in March 1939 and discovered that Czech military understood German armored warfare doctrine better than most German generals. Czech staff had accurately analyzed Guderian's tank theories, identified likely German tactics, even developed reasonable counter-strategies. The problem, Western allies hadn't taken Czech intelligence seriously. French and British military attachés in Prague had received these assessments but filed them away as interesting but unproven theories from small nation prone to exaggerating German threat. Czech warnings about German armor capabilities were dismissed as special pleading for military aid. When Germany invaded Poland 6 months later, Wehrmacht was attacking an opponent who didn't understand what was coming. But that ignorance wasn't inevitable. Czech intelligence had figured it out. Western allies simply didn't listen to those who knew. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m. The German-Polish border near Gross-Kroschland sat in pre-dawn darkness when Guderian's 11th Corps began crossing into Poland. No artillery preparation. No declaration of war. Just sudden eruption of movement as 630 tanks rolled forward in 3 parallel columns, followed by motorized infantry and trucks, followed by horse-drawn supply wagons that couldn't keep pace. Overhead, the distinctive scream of Stuka dive bombers heading east toward Polish airfields. Guderian rode in armoured command vehicle behind lead elements, radio crackling with reports from subordinate units. 1st Panzer Regiment advancing unopposed. reconnaissance elements reporting Polish positions 15 miles ahead, Luftwaffe confirming destruction of Polish aircraft on ground. Within 2 hours, XIX Corps had penetrated 10 miles into Polish territory against minimal resistance. Polish defenders, still mobilizing when attack began, attempted to establish defensive lines but found German armour bypassing their positions entirely, driving past strong points without stopping. By noon, lead elements were 30 miles deep. By nightfall, they had covered 50 miles. The concept Guderian had theorized for 2 decades, trained for a decade, and rehearsed in Spain and Austria was now being tested against actual military opponent. And it was working beyond even Guderian's optimistic projections. The asymmetry between German and Polish military capabilities wasn't primarily technological, it was organizational and doctrinal. Polish army in September 1939 numbered approximately 1 million men organized into 30 infantry divisions plus 11 cavalry brigades. They possessed roughly 800 tanks and armoured vehicles, mostly French Renault R-35s and British Vickers tanks, plus Polish-designed 7th TP light tanks that were actually superior to German Panzer I and II in firepower and armour. Polish Air Force operated 400 combat aircraft. Pilots were well-trained and aggressive. On paper, Poland could mount credible defence. In practice, Polish military operated under doctrinal assumptions that made them incapable of responding to German operational tempo. Polish defence plan assumed 2 weeks for full mobilisation, expected to detect German attack preparations and begin defensive movements before invasion. German attack on September 1st began before Polish mobilisation completed, catching units still, moving to assigned positions. Polish command structure was centralised, requiring orders from Warsaw headquarters for major tactical movements. German command structure emphasised initiative, with junior officers authorised to exploit opportunities without waiting for higher approval. This difference in command philosophy meant German forces consistently made decisions 4 to 6 hours faster than Polish equivalents. In mobile warfare, 6-hour decision advantage is insurmountable. September 3rd, 1939. Guderian's XIX Corps approached the Vistula River, 140 miles from starting position, covered in 48 hours. This advance rate, roughly 70 miles per day, exceeded anything achieved in Great War by a factor of 10. Polish commanders at central headquarters in Warsaw stared at maps showing German penetrations and struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their mobilization plan assumed German forces would need days or weeks to break through. Polish border defenses, providing time for reserves to form defensive lines along major rivers. Instead, German panzers were at the Vistula, while Polish reserves were still boarding trains. Polish Poznan army, positioned to defend western approaches to Warsaw, suddenly found itself north of main German axis of advance, irrelevant to battle, that was occurring 50 miles away. Polish Lodz army, attempting to establish defensive line south of Warsaw, was already being bypassed by German mechanized units driving southeast toward Brest-Litovsk. The entire Polish defensive concept trading space for time, falling back to prepared positions, assumed enemy would obligingly wait for Polish forces to get into position. German operational tempo rendered Polish strategy obsolete before it could be implemented. The Battle of the Bzura River, September 9th through 20th, demonstrated both the power of Guderian's doctrine and the vulnerability of forces unprepared for mechanized warfare. Polish Poznan and Pomorze armies, approximately 200,000 men, launched massive counterattack westward from vicinity of Kutno, hitting northern flank of German 8th Army advancing on Warsaw. This was largest Polish offensive operation of campaign, well planned and aggressively executed. Initial Polish assaults achieved surprise, overrunning German infantry positions and capturing substantial numbers of prisoners. German 8th Army commander reported situation as critical, requested immediate reinforcements. Guderian's XIX Corps, then operating nearly 100 miles southeast of Bzura battlefield, received orders to wheel north and attack Polish counteroffensive from rear. The reorientation demonstrated Panzer Division's operational flexibility. In 36 hours, Guderian's units disengaged from current operation, marched 100 miles north, and attacked into Polish flank and rear. Polish forces having achieved local success against German infantry, suddenly found armoured divisions attacking their supply lines and command posts. Within 72 hours, Polish counteroffensive collapsed. Within 10 days, entire Poznan and Pomorze armies were encircled. Final count: 120,000 Polish prisoners, making Bzura one of the largest encirclement battles in history to that point. Guderian's ability to rapidly shift his entire corps over 100-mile distances and immediately engage in heavy combat demonstrated exactly the operational flexibility his doctrine promised. The role of Luftwaffe air superiority in German success cannot be overstated and provides essential context for understanding Blitzkrieg's effectiveness. German air attacks on September 1st destroyed approximately 300 Polish aircraft on ground in first 48 hours, roughly three-quarters of Polish air force. This left German ground forces operating under near-total air superiority, allowing reconnaissance aircraft to locate Polish positions and troop movements, while Stuka dive bombers provided close air support to advancing panzers. Polish forces attempting to move reserves to threatened sectors found themselves attacked by German aircraft during daylight hours, forcing movement to night and dramatically slowing deployment times. German tanks advancing with Luftwaffe air cover could bypass Polish strongpoints, confident that Stukas would suppress any serious resistance. Polish tanks attempting to counterattack moved without air support and were attacked by German aircraft during approach marches, often sustaining heavy casualties before reaching German positions. The combined arms integration, armour plus aviation plus motorised infantry, all coordinated by radio, created a combat system where whole was exponentially greater than sum of parts. Polish forces fought bravely, often heroically, but they were fighting 20th century combined arms force with 19th century organisational concepts. September 14th, 1939. Guderian's XIX Corps linked up with German 14th Army advancing from south, completing encirclement of Polish forces east of Warsaw. Simultaneously, Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from east, implementing secret protocol of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in August. Polish forces now faced two-front invasion by overwhelming forces. September 17th, Polish government fled to Romania. September 27, Warsaw garrison surrendered after week-long siege. October 6th, last organised Polish resistance ceased. The campaign lasted 36 days, from invasion to capitulation. German casualties, 16,000 killed, 30,000 wounded. Polish casualties, 66,000 killed, 133,000 wounded, 420,000 captured by Germans, plus 250,000 captured by Soviets. Poland ceased to exist as independent nation, partitioned between Germany and Soviet Union. And Guderian's operational doctrine had been validated through actual combat against actual enemy. The theories were proven. Blitzkrieg worked. The statistical analysis of XIX Corps performance reveals exactly how Guderian's integrated doctrine multiplied combat effectiveness. His corps began campaign with approximately 800 tanks. After 18 days of continuous operations, about 400 were still operational, 50% loss rate. But breakdown shows most losses were mechanical failures, not combat damage. 300 tanks disabled by mechanical problems, 80 destroyed or heavily damaged by enemy action, 20 captured intact when crews abandoned them during breakdown. Combat exchange ratio was approximately 30-1 in German favour. For every German tank destroyed by Polish forces, German tanks and supporting arms destroyed approximately 30 Polish armoured vehicles. This wasn't because German tanks were superior, they generally weren't. Polish 7th TP light tank had better gun and armour than Panzer 1 or 2. Advantage came from German combined arms, coordination, air superiority, radio communications, and tactical initiative. Individual tank versus tank engagements usually favoured Polish armour. Combined German force operating as coordinated system overwhelmed Polish units before tank versus tank combat could occur. System integration proved more important than individual platform quality, exactly as Guderian predicted. The international reaction to Poland's defeat mixed shock at speed with uncertainty about implications. British and French governments, having declared war on Germany September 3rd, watched Poland collapse in under 3 weeks without being able to provide meaningful assistance. British military analysts noted German operational tempo but attributed Polish defeat partly to Polish military inadequacy. French General Staff reviewed German tactics and concluded Blitzkrieg worked against weak opponent on open terrain but wouldn't succeed against French fortifications and superior French armour. Soviet observers were fascinated. This was operational warfare at tempo. They had theorized in deep operations doctrine, now demonstrated by different military. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, later commanding Soviet forces against Japanese in Manchuria, studied German-Polish campaign and began implementing similar mobile tactics in his own operations. American military attachés filed detailed reports describing German combined arms operations. But US Army was tiny, approximately 174,000 men, and operating with minimal budget. So analysis remained academic. Only power that truly understood significance was Wehrmacht itself. Blitzkrieg doctrine had passed combat test. Equipment worked well enough, training was adequate. Doctrine was validated. Next challenge would be far more substantial. France possessed more and better tanks, more troops, fortified positions, and professional army with modern equipment. Poland campaign proved Blitzkrieg could destroy weak opponent quickly. France campaign would determine whether it could defeat great power. The moral reckoning of Poland campaign requires acknowledgement even in military documentary context. Wehrmacht invasion of Poland wasn't merely military operation, it was first step in Nazi Germany's campaign of racial extermination in Eastern Europe. SS Einsatzgruppen followed Wehrmacht into Poland, beginning systematic murder of Polish intellectuals, clergy, and Jews. Wehrmacht itself participated in atrocities, executing prisoners and civilians. Guderian was army officer, not SS, and there's no evidence he personally ordered atrocities. But he commanded military operation that enabled genocide. His tactical success made Nazi occupation possible. This connection between military effectiveness and moral catastrophe cannot be severed. Guderian's armor doctrine worked. It worked to enable regime that was murdering millions. Technical appreciation of his military innovations must coexist with recognition of what those innovations achieved strategically. Blitzkrieg was brilliant. Blitzkrieg was also instrument of evil. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. February 17th, 1940. Wehrmacht, headquarters in Koblenz, conference room, thick with cigarette smoke and tension. General Heinz Guderian stood before map of Western Europe, pointer tracing route through Ardennes forest from German border to French Meuse River. Around table sat German General Staff officers whose skepticism was almost physical presence in room. Guderian's plan, designated Case Yellow, proposed concentrating German armour for breakthrough via Ardennes, terrain officially classified as impassable to armoured forces by both German and French military doctrine. Chief of General Staff Franz Halder listened to presentation, then spoke words that would echo through military history. "This is not a plan, this is a recipe for catastrophe." Guderian's response was quiet but absolute. The French believe Ardennes is impassable. They've built their entire defensive strategy around that assumption, which is precisely why we must go through it. The argument that followed wasn't about whether Ardennes offensive could succeed. Everyone agreed it probably couldn't. Argument was whether catastrophic failure would be worse than continuing current stalemate. Hitler, characteristically, embraced the reckless option. The plan that German General Staff believed would destroy Wehrmacht was approved for execution. The geographical reality of Ardennes forest made everyone's skepticism rational. The Ardennes spans approximately 80 miles west from German border through Luxembourg and Belgium to French frontier, heavily forested terrain with few roads, those roads narrow and winding through valleys between steep hills. French Maginot Line, massive fortification system, extended along Franco-German border but deliberately stopped at Ardennes because French military planners calculated that terrain itself was better obstacle than concrete and steel. French General Staff's conclusion: German armour couldn't transit Ardennes in force without taking weeks, providing ample warning for French reserves to counter any breakthrough attempt. This assessment wasn't stupid, it was reasonable based on conventional military analysis. Roads through Ardennes could accommodate single vehicle width in many places, meaning German armour column would stretch hundreds of miles in length, unable to deploy into combat formation, vulnerable to air attack during entire transit. German logistics officers calculated that moving single Panzer Corps through Ardennes would create traffic jam exceeding 100 miles in length. Guderian's plan called for 3 Panzer Corps, 1,200 tanks, and 41,000 vehicles total. Simple arithmetic suggested this was impossible. The origin of Ardennes plan reveals accident of military history and one man's fanatical obsession with mechanized warfare. Original German war plan for Western offensive, developed by General Staff in autumn 1939, called for modified version of Great War Schlieffen Plan, main attack through Belgium, sweeping around French fortifications to reach Paris. It was conventional, predictable, and would probably result in grinding attrition campaign like 1914 through 18. Erich von Manstein, Chief of Staff for Army Group A, proposed radical alternative. Feint through Belgium to draw British and French armies north, then launch primary attack through Ardennes with concentrated armour, breaking through at Sedan and racing to English Channel to encircle Allied armies. General Staff rejected this plan repeatedly, too risky, too dependent on surprise, too vulnerable if French discovered German intentions. Manstein was transferred to inactive command to silence his objections, but Hitler heard about plan through separate channels, summoned Manstein for explanation, and was captivated by its audacity. By February 1940, Manstein plan, named for its author, had become official strategy, despite General Staff consensus that it was militarily insane. Guderian's role in refining Ardennes' plan transformed abstract strategy into operational reality. Once Hitler approved Manstein's concept, Guderian received assignment to determine whether Panzer Corps could actually transit Ardennes and break through at Sedan. His analysis began with historical research. In 1870, Prussian cavalry had moved through Ardennes during Franco-Prussian War. If horses could transit the terrain, tanks could too, just more slowly and with elaborate traffic control. Guderian personally drove through Ardennes in civilian clothes during early 1940, noting road conditions, bridge capacities, and potential bottlenecks. His conclusion: movement was possible but required perfect traffic discipline, and accepting that panzer divisions would be strung out vulnerably for 48 hours. Risk was enormous, but Guderian calculated French would need 72 hours to recognise German main effort and shift reserves, providing narrow 24-hour window for breakthrough at Sedan before French reinforcements arrived. Everything depended on speed and French slowness. It was gamble. But it was gamble that could win war. The force assembly for Ardennes operation revealed scale of German commitment and vulnerability. Army Group A, commanded by Gerd von Rundstedt, concentrated 45 infantry divisions plus 7 panzer divisions in area opposite Ardennes, roughly 700,000 men and 1,200 tanks. Panzer Group Kleist, containing most of armour, was organised in 3 corps. Guderian's of Zevenayeps, Corps 1st, 2nd and 10th Panzer Divisions. Reinhardt's XLI Corps, 6th and 8th Panzer Divisions, and Hoth's XV Corps, 5th and 7th Panzer. The plan called for this enormous mechanised force to move through Ardennes on 3 narrow roads, reach Meuse River at Sedan within 3 days, force river crossing on 4th day, then exploit west toward English Channel. Logistics staff calculated German columns would stretch 150 miles from German border to Meuse, crossing sites, largest traffic jam in military history. If French Air Force discovered this column during transit, sustained bombing would create catastrophic losses and permanent traffic blockage. If French intelligence recognised Sedan as main attack, French reserves could meet German forces at Meuse River with overwhelming defensive advantage. If anything delayed, German advance blown bridges, Belgian resistance, traffic accidents, entire timeline collapsed and operation failed. German success required perfect execution plus French mistakes. It required enemy cooperation in their own defeat. French defensive dispositions in May 1940 reflected strategic assumption that shaped their entire military doctrine. Next war would be like last war. French army fielded approximately 100 divisions, roughly 3,000 tanks, many superior to German equivalents, and 3,000 aircraft. French Char B-1 heavy tank had 60mm armour and 75mm gun, could destroy any German tank at range beyond German ability to penetrate its armour. French Saumur S-35 medium tank was faster, better armoured and more reliable than German Panzer III. French numerical and qualitative superiority in armour was clear, but French tanks were distributed among infantry divisions for support role, not concentrated in armoured divisions for exploitation. French command structure was rigidly centralised, requiring approval from high command for major tactical movements. French radio communications were limited, most tanks communicated via flags and runners, and French defensive strategy, the Dial plan, called for French and British forces to advance into Belgium when Germans attacked, establishing defensive line along Dial River to protect Brussels. This meant best French and British units would be moving north exactly as Germans intended, leaving weak second-rate divisions holding Sedan sector. Germans were attacking French assumptions as much as French positions. The human element of impending operation deserves attention because it reveals disconnect between high command and frontline soldiers. In German staging areas opposite Ardennes, tank crews prepared vehicles and tried not to think about what they'd been told in briefings. Narrow forest roads, 100-mile traffic jams, French aircraft overhead, then assault crossing of major river against fortified positions. Company commanders confided to diaries that operations seemed suicidal. Junior officers wrote final letters home. Maintenance crews worked triple shifts, ensuring every vehicle was mechanically perfect, knowing there would be no second chances if tanks broke down in Ardennes forests. Meanwhile, in French Second Army positions at Sedan, reservist soldiers, many in their 30s and 40s, recalled from civilian life, manned bunkers built in 1918 and not substantially improved since. They'd been told Ardennes was impassable, that German main attack would come through Belgium in north, that their sector was quiet zone where nothing important would happen. French Second Army was designated Class B formation, second-rate troops with minimal training, older equipment, lowest priority for reinforcements. German intelligence had identified this weakness through signals, intercepts, and air reconnaissance. Guderian was about to attack strongest fortified position on Western Front held by weakest defenders in French army. Everything depended on reaching those positions before French realized they were primary target. The final German wargame of Ardennes Operation, conducted in March 1940, nearly caused plans cancellation and revealed exactly how fragile German chances were. Exercise umpires, applying realistic combat assessments, ruled that German armour would suffer catastrophic losses attempting to force Meuse crossing against prepared French defences. They calculated German panzers would reach Sedan, but then be stopped by French artillery and counterattacks, creating static battle of attrition exactly like Great War. Guderian objected violently, arguing umpires underestimated speed of German advance and overestimated French reaction time. Heated argument followed. Chief of Staff Halder supported umpires' assessment. Plan would fail. Guderian threatened to resign if not given freedom to execute breakthrough according to his doctrine. Hitler intervened, overruling General Staff and authorizing Guderian to disregard conventional timelines and push for breakthrough regardless of risks. This was a moment when Wehrmacht committed to strategy its own professional military leadership believed would fail. They were proceeding based on Hitler's political intuition and Guderian's doctrinal fanaticism, overruling rational military analysis. It was institutionalized recklessness on national scale, and it was about to succeed beyond anyone's expectations. The psychological dimension of Ardennes Operation extended beyond military planning into national character and historical grievance. Germany had lost Great War after 4 years of attrition that killed 2 million German soldiers and accomplished nothing except defeat. Versailles Treaty had humiliated Germany, forced reparations that crippled economy, stripped away territory, and imposed military restrictions that Wehrmacht was now violating. This wasn't just military operation, it was national revenge. Guderian embodied this perfectly. Lieutenant who watched Germany's defeat in 1918, professional soldier who spent 2 decades preparing for redemption. His entire career was directed toward reversing Versailles, proving German military could defeat France decisively where 1914 through 18 achieved only stalemate. Personal and national motivations merged. Meanwhile, French military psychology remained traumatized by Great War experience. 1.4 million French soldiers killed, generation destroyed, national resources exhausted to achieve victorious stalemate. French defensive mentality reflected determination never to repeat that sacrifice. Maginot Line represented fortress mentality, belief that fortifications could prevent another war of movement and attrition. Both sides were fighting previous wars' ghosts. Only Germans recognized that technology and doctrine had made previous wars' lessons obsolete. May 13th, 1940, 8 a.m. Heinz Guderian stood on east bank of Meuse River, south of Sedan, field glasses raised, examining French bunkers barely 300 meters across the water. He'd arrived at the Meuse 3 days earlier, exactly on schedule, despite German staff prediction that Ardennes transit would take 2 weeks. Behind him, 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions were coiled in forests, tank crews checking equipment, infantry preparing, rubber assault boats, artillery positioning, guns. Across river, French 55th Infantry Division manned fortifications built in 1918, bunkers with excellent fields of fire covering every potential crossing point. French defenders had fought competently for 2 days, destroying several German bridging attempts and inflicting steady casualties on reconnaissance elements. But Guderian saw something in French defensive fires that gave him hope. Coordination was poor, response times were slow, and above all, French artillery seemed confused and uncoordinated. French Second Army command structure was collapsing under stress, units losing communication with headquarters, orders arriving hours late or not at all. The psychological moment for breakthrough was now. Before French reinforcements arrived, Guderian radioed code word to Luftwaffe liaison officer Valley Festival. Within minutes, largest concentrated air attack in warfare history to that moment began to unfold. The Stuka assault on Sedan, 3 p.m. May 13th through 7 p.m. redefined close air support and revealed psychological dimension of modern warfare. Luftwaffe committed entire Luftflotte, 3 to single objective, suppressing French defences at Sedan crossing points. 1,500 aircraft, Junkers Ju, 87 Stuka dive bombers, Heinkel He 111 medium bombers, Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters conducted continuous attack on 6 Mile front. Individual Stukas dove on specific bunkers, releasing bombs from low altitude, pulling up mere meters above ground. New wave appeared every 15 to 20 minutes, never more than 3 minutes between attacks, creating effect of continuous bombardment. French troops in bunkers experienced something no soldiers in previous wars had endured: sustained aerial bombardment that went on for hours without pause. The physical damage from bombs was significant, but not overwhelming. Concrete bunkers withstood most hits. Psychological damage was catastrophic. French telephone lines were cutting defenders from higher command. French officers attempting to coordinate response couldn't hear orders over aircraft noise. Soldiers cowering in bunkers lost situational awareness, had no idea what was happening beyond immediate vicinity. Most critically, French artillery, which should have prevented German river crossing, fell silent. Gun crews abandoned positions or became so disoriented they couldn't coordinate fire missions. By 6 p.m., French defensive coordination had shattered. Positions were still occupied, guns still functional, but coherent defense had dissolved into isolated strongpoints fighting individually. 4 p.m., while Stuka attacks continued overhead, German infantry assault began. First wave. Combat engineers in rubber rafts, paddling across Meuse under covering fire from German machine guns on East Bank. French bunkers opened fire sporadically, individual positions engaging targets they could see, but no coordinated defensive fires. German infantry casualties were heavy, approximately 50% in first assault wave, but survivors reached West Bank and began attacking French bunkers from behind, using grenades and flamethrowers to neutralize positions. Second wave followed immediately, more rafts, more infantry, gradually expanding bridgehead. French defenders fought back courageously in many positions, individual soldiers manning guns until killed, but defensive coordination never recovered. By 7 p.m., German infantry controlled half-mile stretch of West Bank. By midnight, engineers were assembling pontoon bridges under spotlights, working frantically to create crossings strong enough for tanks. French artillery fired intermittently at bridges, but couldn't concentrate enough fire to destroy them. French infantry units attempting to counterattack moved slowly, without coordination, arriving piecemeal and being destroyed by German forces already across. The crossing succeeded not because Germans were irresistible, but because French command structure couldn't coordinate response faster than German engineers could build bridges. May 14th, 2 a.m. First German tanks crossed pontoon bridge at Sedan, low-slung Panzer IIIs moving cautiously across swaying structure, crews tense, knowing single artillery hit could send them into river. Guderian waded across partially completed bridge earlier at midnight because he couldn't wait for official crossing and needed to personally assess situation on West Bank. This was characteristic Guderian, habitually exposed himself to frontline danger that corps commanders weren't supposed to experience, drawing criticism from superiors but inspiring absolute loyalty from subordinates who knew their generals shared their risks. By 4 a.m., 100 tanks were across. By 8 a.m., 300. By noon, entire 1st Panzer Division was across Meuse and advancing west, meeting minimal resistance. French 55th Division had essentially ceased to exist as coherent military formation. 60% of its soldiers, dead, wounded, or captured, remained scattered and fleeing south. French 2nd Army headquarters received reports of breakthrough but couldn't determine its scale or coordinate counterattack. And Guderian, violating explicit orders to halt and consolidate bridgehead, ordered immediate exploitation westward. His reasoning was simple. French command structure was paralyzed, reinforcements weren't arriving yet, window of opportunity was open. Every hour wasted was hour French could use to organize defense. Speed now would determine whether breakthrough became encirclement or merely created dangerous salient Germans couldn't exploit. The scale of what Guderian had achieved becomes clear through comparison. Crossing Meuse at Sedan had been considered most difficult military operation on Western Front major river, heavily fortified both banks, covering artillery, multiple French reserve divisions within days' march. German staff planning assumed crossing would take 5 to 7 days and cost 5 to 10,000 casualties. Actual duration: 16 hours from first infantry assault to functional tank bridge. Actual casualties: 1st Panzer Division lost 156 killed crossing Meuse. Horrific for individual units but remarkably light for operations scale. French 55th Division lost approximately 4,000 casualties plus 6,000 captured. More importantly, Guderian had achieved breakthrough before French High Command understood where main German attack was occurring. French reserves were still moving north into Belgium, responding to German feint through that region, when German armour was already 15 miles west of Sedan and accelerating. The psychological paralysis Stuka attacks created among French defenders was replicated at operational level. French commanders couldn't process information fast enough to respond. By time they understood what was happening, situation had evolved beyond their ability to contain it. The French counterattack that might have sealed Sedan breakthrough never materialized with adequate force because French command structure couldn't adapt to German operational tempo. French 3rd Armoured Division, equipped with excellent Char B-1 heavy tanks, received orders to attack German bridgehead on May 14th. Division began movement towards Sedan but immediately encountered refugees clogging roads, making progress slow. Luftwaffe bombers attacked column during approach march, destroying fuel trucks and creating traffic jams. Division required 24 hours to cover 40 miles, by which time German bridgehead had expanded to 15-mile depth, and 1st Panzer Division was already beyond range of counterattack. French 4th Armoured Division, forming near Laon, attempted similar counterattack on May 17th, but arrived piecemeal, battalion-sized elements attacking individually rather than as coordinated division. German anti-tank guns destroyed French tanks as they arrived, defeating each element separately before next arrived. This pattern repeated across entire French defensive response. Correct decisions made too slowly, executed without coordination, arriving after circumstances had changed. French armour was superior, vehicle for vehicle, to German tanks. French tactical decisions were often sound, but French decision cycle operated at 19th century speed while German forces moved at 20th century tempo. Speed differential was insurmountable. The operational decisions Guderian made during May 14th through 17th revealed his doctrine's full implications and also highlighted tensions within German command structure. German Army High Command OKH issued repeated orders for Guderian to halt, consolidate, and wait for infantry divisions to catch up before continuing westward advance. Traditional military doctrine supported this caution. Guderian's Panzer corridor was extremely narrow, unsupported by infantry on flanks, vulnerable to counterattack that would cut supply lines and isolate armor spearheads. Every conventional military assessment said continuing advance was recklessly dangerous. Guderian ignored every such order, employing what became known as reconnaissance in force, excuse claiming he was merely patrolling forward, not conducting major offensive operations, therefore didn't need higher authorization. This was transparent fiction. Everyone knew Guderian was conducting major offensive exploitation in direct violation of orders. But he was also succeeding spectacularly, advancing 40 miles per day while French command structure disintegrated. Hitler, characteristically, sided with aggressive subordinate against cautious staff officers. Guderian received retroactive authorization for movements that had already occurred. Pattern was established. Guderian would violate orders, succeed, and be forgiven. This worked until it didn't. But in May 1940, it was producing greatest German military victory in generations. The human cost of Sedan breakthrough appears in individual unit records and deserves acknowledgement even in documentary, emphasizing operational rather than human dimensions. 1st Panzer Division's Assault Engineer Battalion, which conducted initial river crossing, suffered 280 casualties out of 500-man strength, 56% casualty rate in 6 hours. Lieutenant Walter Rubath's company crossed in first wave. 38 men, 16 survived uninjured. These men died or were wounded, creating foothold that enabled entire campaign success. On French side, 55th Division's 47th Infantry Regiment ceased to exist as functioning unit, approximately 2,000 casualties plus 3,000 surrendered from regiment's pre-war strength of 3,500. Individual bunkers fought until overrun, crews killed at their guns. Both sides experienced individual heroism, individual tragedy, individual sacrifice. But operational outcome was determined not by individual bravery. Both sides displayed that, but by systemic advantages. German command structure possessed faster decision-making, better communications, integrated combined arms coordination. Courage was distributed equally. Organizational effectiveness was not. The strategic implications of Sedan breakthrough became apparent within 72 hours. By May 17th, Guderian's X and I-Sec Corps had advanced 100 miles west from Sedan, reaching Peronne. Other Panzer Corps were achieving comparable advances. German armour was approaching English Channel, threatening to cut off entire British Expeditionary Force and French First Army Group operating in Belgium. This wasn't just tactical success or operational victory, it was strategic catastrophe for Allies. Most experienced, best-equipped British and French units were about to be encircled by German forces that had achieved breakthrough everyone thought impossible. Churchill, newly appointed British Prime Minister, received reports from France with growing horror, realizing Britain might lose its entire professional army within weeks of Germany launching offensive. French Premier Paul Reynaud called Churchill, "We have been defeated. We are beaten." Churchill's response, "How?" The Meuse River has been crossed, captured Allied incomprehension. Crossing one river shouldn't decide entire campaign, but it had, because crossing was an isolated tactical event. It was a moment when German operational doctrine overwhelmed French military system that couldn't adapt to speed and coordination Germany displayed. The 48 hours at Sedan, May 13th through 14th, genuinely were a hinge of war in Western Europe. Before Sedan, Allied and German forces were roughly matched, campaign's outcome uncertain. After Sedan, German operational victory was probable and perhaps inevitable. Everything that followed encirclement at Dunkirk, collapse of France, British evacuation flowed from breakthrough Guderian achieved in those 48 hours. This creates troubling historical question. Was Sedan breakthrough inevitable, or was it contingent on specific failures? Could competent French response have contained German advance? Evidence suggests yes, if French Air Force had interdicted German columns in Ardennes, if French reserves had counterattacked in first 24 hours, if French command structure had responded at German tempo rather than Great War tempo. But those are counterfactuals. What actually happened was that every necessary condition for German success aligned. Ardennes transit succeeded. Luftwaffe achieved surprise. French defences shattered. French counterattacks failed. Guderian's gamble paid off. His career of preparation met perfect moment of execution, and European history pivoted on 48 hours in May 1940, May 15th, 1940, 9 a.m. French Supreme Commander General Maurice Gamelin stood in his headquarters at Vincennes, staring at situation map with expression witnesses described as stunned disbelief. Red arrows representing German Panzer penetrations extended 50 miles west of Sedan, distance that shouldn't have been possible in 72 hours. Gamelin turned to British liaison officer and spoke words that captured Allied incomprehension. The Germans cannot possibly be there already, but they were. Guderian's XIX Corps had advanced at average rate of 30 miles per day for 3 consecutive days, covering distance that Great War armies needed months to achieve. French staff officers scrambled to update maps, plotting German positions that rendered previous defensive plans obsolete before they could be implemented. Most alarming, German Panzer corridor was only 15 to 20 miles wide, enormous mechanized force advancing through narrow gap, unsupported by infantry on flanks, supply lines stretched thin, theoretically vulnerable to counterattack that would cut spearhead from its base. French military doctrine said such penetration was suicidal, would inevitably be severed and destroyed, but French doctrine assumed defenders could react faster than attackers could advance. Guderian was violating that assumption through sheer speed, moving faster than French command structure could process information and coordinate response. The operational vulnerability of German Panzer corridor was real, not imagined by nervous German staff officers. Guderian's 3 divisions, 1st, 2nd, and 10th Panzer, stretched across 100-mile advance route from Sedan to current positions near Péronne. Northern flank was exposed to French armies in Belgium. Southern flank was exposed to whatever French reserves could reach the battlefield. Supply lines consisted of single main road packed with fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, repair vehicles, all moving forward through corridor barely 20 miles wide. If French mechanized forces had attacked this corridor in strength during May 15th through 18th, they could have severed German spearhead, isolated forward panzer divisions, potentially destroyed entire armoured striking force. This was exactly what German high command feared, why they issued repeated halt orders Guderian ignored. But French counterattacks, when they came, arrived piecemeal battalion here, brigade there, without coordination or concentration. German anti-tank guns and supporting infantry defeated each attack individually before next arrived. French had correct operational concept, attacked the flanks, but couldn't execute with necessary speed and mass. Meanwhile, Guderian kept driving west, gambling that French would remain paralysed long enough for him to reach English Channel, May 16th. Guderian received radio message from Panzergruppe Kleist headquarters. Halt all forward movement immediately. Consolidate current positions. Await arrival of infantry divisions. This was 5th halt order in 3 days, each one citing same reasoning: advance was too rapid, too risky, creating vulnerable, salient. Guderian's response has become legendary in military history, though accounts vary on exact phrasing. His radio operator reported atmospheric interference preventing reception of orders. Guderian continued advancing west, later claiming he understood order as suggestion rather than directive, or that he was conducting reconnaissance in force, which didn't require higher authorization. This was obvious. Fiction Corps commander doesn't misunderstand direct order to halt, but Guderian believed that stopping now would allow French time to organize coherent defense. That momentum was everything that success required, accepting risks conventional doctrine wouldn't tolerate. He was committing career suicide, disobeying multiple direct orders from superior officers, gambling that operational success would retroactively justify insubordination. It was act of monumental arrogance. It also worked. The mechanization of German infantry divisions, or more accurately, their lack of mechanization, created fundamental limit on Wehrmacht operational capability that rarely appears in popular accounts of Blitzkrieg. German panzer divisions were fully motorized. Tanks, trucks, armoured cars, every vehicle, mechanized and capable of sustained, high-speed movement. But standard German infantry divisions moved primarily on foot, with supplies and artillery pulled by horses. Wehrmacht, in 1940, employed approximately 700,000 horses, more horses than Napoleon's Grand Army. This meant panzer divisions could advance 30 miles per day, while infantry divisions following them could manage maybe 10 miles per day. Gap between armour spearhead and supporting infantry grew wider every day of rapid advance. By May 18th, Guderian's forward elements were 150 miles ahead of nearest infantry support. This created a situation where German armour was racing through France essentially alone, with minimal infantry to hold captured territory, consolidate positions, or defend supply lines. If French had mounted serious counterattack, German panzers would have faced it unsupported. This limitation horse-drawn logistics, creating tempo differential within German army itself, would prove catastrophic in Soviet Union a year later. In France, it merely created anxiety among German high command while Guderian's gamble continued paying off. May 18th. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements reached Peronne, 100 miles from Sedan, 200 miles from German starting positions. They'd covered this distance in 6 days of continuous movement, averaging 33 miles per day, including combat operations. By comparison, fastest Allied advance during Great War's 100 Days Offensive in 1918 averaged 5 miles per day. German operational tempo was literally 6 times faster than anything previous war had produced. French military leadership simply had no framework for processing this speed. Their decision-making cycle received reports, analyze situation, issue orders, transmit orders to field units, wait for execution required 24 to 48 hours minimum. By time French orders reached frontline units, situation had evolved beyond recognition. German commanders, operating under doctrine of mission-type orders that emphasized initiative over detailed instructions, could adapt to changing circumstances in hours rather than days. This tempo differential compounded every other German advantage. Even when French made correct decisions, they implemented them too slowly to matter. The psychological dimension of French collapse deserves attention because it reveals how armies disintegrate before they're actually defeated. French soldiers in many positions fought courageously when engaged. French tanks, when they reached battlefield, often outperformed German equivalents in direct combat. French artillery, when properly positioned and supplied, inflicted serious casualties on German forces. But these tactical successes occurred in strategic vacuum because French command structure had lost control of the campaign. Officers at company and battalion level followed orders, held positions, counterattacked when possible. But division and corps commanders couldn't coordinate their units' actions because they didn't know where German forces were or where their own units were. Radio communications in French army were limited. Commanders relied on telephone lines that German advance had cut. Motorcycle couriers were delayed by refugee-clogged roads. French generals commanded blind, issuing orders to units whose positions they didn't know against enemy whose locations they couldn't determine. This wasn't moral failure or cowardice, it was institutional collapse of command and control system that couldn't function at modern operational tempo. Armies don't just lose battles. They lose ability to fight coherently, and at that point, outcome is determined regardless of individual courage or weapons quality. May 20th. Reconnaissance elements of 2nd Panzer Division reached Abbeville on English Channel coast, 10 days from crossing Meuse at Sedan to reaching Atlantic, 220 miles covered. Entire British expeditionary force, approximately 250,000 men plus French. First Army Group, approximately 150,000 men, were now cut off in Belgium and northern France, isolated from main French armies in South. Guderian's operational vision had been realised. Concentrated armour, achieving breakthrough, exploiting at high speed, reaching operational objectives before defenders could react. The British and French troops in encircled pocket were experienced, well-equipped, and dangerous. They would make Germans pay heavily for eventual conquest. But strategically they were finished, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, with German armour between them and safety. Churchill's worst fears were being realised. Britain faced prospect of losing its entire professional army within weeks, leaving home islands defended by undertrained reserves with inadequate equipment. The military disaster unfolding in France would determine whether Britain could continue fighting at all. The supply crisis German armour experienced during this advance revealed both weakness and strength of Wehrmacht logistics system. Guderian's rapid advance outran supply vehicles. Fuel trucks couldn't keep pace with tanks travelling 30+ miles per day over uncertain roads. By May 19th, 1st Panzer Division was critically low on fuel, some tanks literally running on fumes, advance beginning to slow from logistical exhaustion rather than enemy resistance. Traditional military response would be halt until supplies catch up. Guderian's response was characteristic. His units captured French fuel depots intact, used French gasoline to continue German advance. This worked in France because French logistics system collapsed faster than it could destroy its own supplies. It was operational improvisation elevated to doctrine, counting on capturing enemy supplies rather than waiting for your own. This approach had obvious limitations. It only worked against enemy whose organisation was dissolving, couldn't sustain operations against competent opponent who would destroy supplies before capture. But in May 1940, against French army whose command structure had shattered, it enabled continued advance that conventional logistics couldn't support. The human experience of this advance deserves consideration because it reveals physical and psychological cost of sustained, high-tempo operations. German tank crews had been in continuous combat or movement for 10 days, sleeping 3 to 4 hours per night in or beside their vehicles, eating cold rations, performing maintenance in darkness, then climbing back into tanks for another day of advance. Fatigue was comprehensive, drivers falling asleep at controls, gunners hallucinating targets, commanders making decisions with reflexes slowed by exhaustion. Tank interiors were cramped, noisy, hot, stinking of oil and sweat and cordite. Crews urinated into empty shell casings, defecated in hastily dug holes during brief maintenance stops. This wasn't glorious mobile warfare, it was grinding physical ordeal that wore men down as effectively as combat casualties. But German doctrine emphasized maintaining tempo regardless of exhaustion because stopping allowed enemy to recover. So advance continued, zombie army of exhausted soldiers driving forward on adrenaline and discipline, achieving operational objectives while barely functional as human beings. Multiple German commanders later described May 1940 as most physically demanding experience of their military careers, worse than later combat in Soviet Union because of unrelenting pace maintained day after day without pause. May 21st. British counterattack at Arras demonstrated both continued Allied fighting capability and ultimate futility of tactical success without operational coherence. British armoured forces, approximately 74 Matilda tanks, plus supporting infantry attacked German positions south of Arras, hitting northern flank of German Panzer corridor. British Matilda II infantry tanks had 78mm armour that German 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate. Initial British assault overran German positions, destroyed several dozen German tanks, briefly threatened to cut German supply lines. For several hours, German commanders at Arras genuinely feared their advance had been severed. Then German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, pressed into emergency anti-tank role, began destroying British tanks at ranges beyond British guns' effectiveness. Luftwaffe bombers attacked British supply columns. German reserves counterattacked British flanks. By evening, British force withdrew, having inflicted significant casualties but failing to achieve operational objective. Arras demonstrated that Allied forces, when concentrated and properly coordinated, could still hurt Wehrmacht. But isolated tactical success didn't change strategic situation. British remained encircled, German corridor remained intact, and advance continued toward its logical conclusion. The week from May 13th, Sedan breakthrough to May 20th, reaching Channel Coast, represented operational warfare at tempo, unprecedented in military history, and rarely equalled since. Guderian's XIX Corps advanced 220 miles in 7 days, averaging 31 miles per day, including combat operations, river crossings, and constant harassment by Allied forces. They achieved this while maintaining coordination between multiple divisions, sustaining communications despite rapid movement, and adapting to unexpected situations without losing momentum. This was vindication of everything Guderian had theorized since 1918. Concentrated armor, combined arms coordination, radio communications, and aggressive exploitation could achieve breakthrough and exploitation at speed that paralyzed conventional military responses. But success also created dangerous pattern. German military leadership learned that aggressive violation of conventional doctrine succeeded, that ignoring logistics constraints worked, that operational audacity overcame tactical vulnerability. These lessons were valid against opponents whose command structures couldn't match German tempo. They would prove catastrophically wrong against opponents Soviet Union whose strategic depth and operational reserves could absorb initial defeat and counterattack successfully. But that lesson was a year away. In May 1940, Blitzkrieg appeared to have revolutionized warfare itself. Guderian had proven his theories in most spectacular fashion possible. And Wehrmacht had won a campaign that would reshape Europe for next 5 years. May 23rd, 1940. Guderian's forward reconnaissance element sat 15 miles from Dunkirk, last major port available for Allied evacuation. His panzers had advanced from Sedan to English Channel in 10 days, achieving one of history's great operational manoeuvres. Now they were positioned to deliver killing blow, advance to coast, seal final escape route, trap entire British Expeditionary Force and French First Army against coast, with no way. German infantry divisions were still days behind, struggling to catch up to armoured spearhead. Weather was clear, roads were good, resistance was minimal. Everything favoured immediate advance to complete encirclement. Then radio message arrived from Panzergruppe Kleist headquarters. All Panzer units will halt on current positions immediately. No further advance without explicit authorization from Army Group headquarters. Guderian read message 3 times, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. After 10 days of aggressive exploitation, of violating halt orders, of proving doctrine through success, Wehrmacht was ordering him to stop 15 miles short of complete victory. His response was furious, radio transmission demanding explanation. Answer that came back was simple and catastrophic. Halt order came from Hitler personally. There would be no appeal. May 24th. The halt order remained in effect for 56 hours, from afternoon of May 24th through morning of May 26th, and those hours allowed British evacuation that would alter war's entire trajectory. Guderian's tank crews sat in their vehicles, watching through binoculars as British troops established defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, observing Royal Navy ships beginning evacuation operations, forbidden to advance and close the trap. The frustration was comprehensive and would haunt participants for the rest of their lives. Tank commanders later described sensation of watching prey escape while being forced to remain stationary. Guderian personally drove to Corps' forward positions, observed British defensive preparations 15 miles away, returned to headquarters and placed call to Panzergruppe Kleist, demanding permission to attack. Request denied. He called Army Group A headquarters, making same request to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Denied. German armour sat idle while British Expeditionary Force, which should have been destroyed, was instead being methodically extracted across English Channel to fight another day. Strategic victory was being converted to operational stalemate by single order that made no sense to anyone executing it. The origins of halt order remain debated by historians, with multiple explanations offered and no consensus on which factors were decisive. Hitler's stated reasoning focused on preserving panzer forces for coming battles with French armies still intact south of German breakthrough. He argued that Flanders terrain crisscrossed with canals, dotted with villages, was unsuitable for armour operations, that tanks would be vulnerable in close combat. Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring had lobbied Hitler, promising that his aircraft could destroy trapped British forces without ground assault, enhancing Luftwaffe's prestige at Wehrmacht's expense. Some historians suggest Hitler harboured political motivation, wanting to spare British for potential peace settlement, calculating that completely destroying British army would make Britain fight to bitter end, while allowing evacuation might encourage negotiated peace. Others argue Hitler simply accepted von Rundstedt's professional military assessment that panzer divisions needed maintenance halt after 10 days continuous operations. Most likely, halt order resulted from a combination of factors: genuine concern about tank losses and mechanical wear, Göring's promises, Hitler's political calculations, and von Rundstedt's caution. Whatever the reasoning, result was strategic gift to Britain that allowed it to continue the war. The Dunkirk evacuation, Operation Dynamo, began May 26 and continued through June 4th, ultimately extracting 338,000 226 Allied troops from beaches and harbour under German air attack. Royal Navy vessels, civilian boats, fishing trawlers, pleasure craft, famous little ships of Dunkirk, cross-channel repeatedly under Luftwaffe bombing, loading soldiers from beaches and piers, returning them to England. German aircraft attacked continuously but couldn't prevent evacuation because RAF Fighter Command, operating from British bases, contested air superiority over beaches. Luftwaffe discovered that Stukas devastating against ground targets were vulnerable to modern fighters. British Spitfires and Hurricanes shot down German bombers at rates that forced Goering to scale back attacks. Evacuation that Hitler expected Luftwaffe to prevent succeeded beyond British hopes. Churchill had hoped to save 30,000 men. Instead, Britain extracted essentially entire BEF minus equipment and heavy weapons, but with trained soldiers who would form core of future British armies. This was strategic disaster for Germany, operational level failure that would echo through remaining war years. May 26. Halt order was partially lifted, German armour authorised to resume advance. Guderian's panzers moved forward toward Dunkirk perimeter, now heavily fortified with British and French troops fighting desperately to hold evacuation corridor open. Terrain was exactly as Hitler warned. Canals blocked tank movement, villages provided excellent defensive positions, open ground was swept by British artillery. Advance that might have succeeded easily on May 23rd now became grinding battle of attrition. German tanks suffered casualties attacking prepared positions. British rearguard, knowing they were buying time for comrades' evacuation, fought with determination born of desperation. Each village cost hours to capture. Each canal crossing required combat engineers under fire. German forces slowly compressed evacuation perimeter but couldn't break through before evacuation completed. June 4th, last British troops departed Dunkirk beaches. Wehrmacht occupied empty town, captured abandoned equipment, but Allied soldiers had escaped. Guderian's war diary entry for June 4th is brief and bitter. Today we took Dunkirk, the Dunkirk. British are gone. The strategic implications of halt order and successful British evacuation became clear only over subsequent years, but were catastrophic for Germany. BEF soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk would form experienced corps of British armies in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. Officers who escaped became commanders of divisions that would invade Europe in 1944. Without Dunkirk evacuation, Britain would have lost essentially its entire professional army, leaving home islands defended by under-equipped reserves facing potential German invasion. Churchill's government might have fallen, replaced by faction favouring negotiated peace. Even if Britain continued fighting, reconstituting army from scratch would have required years. Instead, within months, Britain was reinforcing Middle East with Dunkirk veterans, preparing defences against invasion with experienced soldiers. Halt order didn't just save British army, it kept Britain in the war. And Britain remaining in war meant Germany faced ongoing conflict in West while preparing invasion of Soviet Union, faced strategic bombing that diverted resources from Eastern Front, faced eventual base for Allied invasion of France. Single 56-hour halt order contributed to Germany's ultimate defeat more than any single battle loss. Guderian's personal response to halt order evolved from immediate fury to long-term bitterness. In moment, he argued vehemently for continuing advance, cited operational reasons, emphasized vulnerability of delaying. After evacuation succeeded, he blamed Hitler's interference for losing strategic victory, argued in post-war memoirs that Dunkirk represented first major German mistake of campaign. But this judgment is complicated by facts. Yes, halt order allowed British evacuation, but German panzer forces were exhausted, mechanically worn, potentially vulnerable to serious counterattack. Traditional military assessment: pause, consolidate, allow infantry to catch up was defensible. Guderian's aggressive doctrine had worked spectacularly for 2 weeks, but doctrine of ignoring logistics and accepting risk had limits. Dunkirk might have been point where risk caught up with Wehrmacht. We can't know what would have happened if German armour attacked on May 24th. Maybe they would have sealed perimeter and captured entire BEF. Maybe they would have suffered serious casualties in unsuitable terrain and accomplished little. Counterfactuals are tempting, but ultimately speculative. What actually happened was halt order, successful evacuation, and British Army preserved to fight on. The equipment losses Britain suffered at Dunkirk were staggering and nearly as significant as soldier evacuation. British abandoned approximately 2,400 guns, 700 aircraft, 64,000 vehicles, and 76,000 tons of ammunition. Essentially, entire BEF's heavy equipment was lost. Soldiers evacuated, but tanks, artillery, trucks remained behind, captured or destroyed. This meant Britain retained trained soldiers, but lost material for them to use, creating different but still severe problem. Britain would require months to re-equip forces, import or manufacture replacement weapons, rebuild military capability, but crucially, institutional knowledge was preserved, trained officers and NCOs who understood modern warfare, who had experienced German Blitzkrieg firsthand, who could train new formations. Loss of equipment was replaceable given time. Loss of experienced personnel would have been catastrophic and irreversible in short term. Halt order saved the irreplaceable part of British military while allowing Germans to capture the replaceable part. From German strategic perspective, this was worst possible outcome. The psychological impact of halt order on Wehrmacht leadership, and particularly on Guderian, created lasting distrust between frontline commanders and high command. Guderian had disobeyed multiple halt orders during Drive to Channel, succeeded spectacularly, and received retroactive authorization. Then, at critical moment, halt order was enforced and success turned to failure. Lesson Wehrmacht drew from this was ambiguous and dangerous. Aggressive violation of orders sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, and knowing which is which requires either perfect judgment or perfect luck. This created culture where aggressive subordinates felt justified, ignoring orders they disagreed with, citing Guderian's example, while high command tried to maintain operational control over far-flung forces executing rapid advances. Tension between decentralized initiative and centralized control would plague German military operations for the remainder of war, particularly in Soviet Union, where distances and operational complexity made coordination essential but battlefield flexibility equally necessary. Dunkirk halt order crystallized this dilemma without resolving it. June 4th, 1940. British evacuation complete. Wehrmacht occupied Dunkirk. Campaign in northern France ended. German forces turned south to complete defeat of France, attacking French armies that remained intact below Somme River. But strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Britain remained in war, army was intact, and Churchill's government was committed to continuing fight regardless of cost. Germany had won spectacular operational victory, conquered Belgium, Netherlands, defeated Allied forces in northern France, driven British from continent, but strategic victory forcing Britain out of war, establishing German hegemony over Europe, remained elusive. Single 56-hour halt order had prevented strategic success from following operational triumph. Guderian understood this immediately. His bitterness about Dunkirk would last his entire life, reflected in post-war memoirs that devoted substantial space to arguing halt order was mistake. Whether he was right remains debatable. What's certain is that halt order allowed British Army to escape, and that army would help defeat Germany 5 years later. Strategic warfare is decided by such moments, decisions that seem reasonable at time but prove catastrophic in retrospect. Dunkirk was such moment, and Guderian was forced to watch it unfold, helpless to prevent it, knowing that complete victory had been within reach, and then deliberately surrendered by higher command he couldn't overrule. June 5th, 1940, case read full rot, began at dawn. Wehrmacht launched second phase of French campaign, attacking southward across Somme River against French armies that remained intact below German breakthrough corridor. Guderian's XIEPS Corps, reinforced and re-equipped after Dunkirk operations, attacked across Somme near Amiens with objective of driving southeast towards Switzerland, encircling remaining French forces in eastern France. French Fourth Army held defensive positions along river units that hadn't been involved in northern battles, relatively fresh troops with functioning command structure. German planners expected tough resistance, possibly weeks of fighting to break through. What they encountered instead was something unprecedented in modern warfare. Structural collapse of entire military organization, independent of actual battlefield defeats. French defensive lines were well prepared. French soldiers were adequately armed, but French command structure's psychological cohesion had shattered during Northern Campaign. Armies don't just lose battles, they lose will to fight coherently. And once that happens, outcome is determined regardless of tactical situations. The breakthrough across Somme demonstrated how thoroughly French military organisation had disintegrated. Guderian's forces achieved crossing in less than 24 hours against prepared positions, then advanced 60 miles in following 48 hours through terrain that favoured defenders. French units engaged German forces when contact occurred, inflicting casualties and fighting local battles. But there was no coordinated defence, no operational level resistance, no strategic direction. French divisions received orders to hold positions, then discovered German armour had bypassed them and was 30 miles to their rear. They withdrew to new positions, received new orders to hold, discovered they'd been bypassed again. This wasn't tactical defeat, it was operational paralysis. French command structure couldn't process German movement speed, couldn't coordinate responses, couldn't maintain coherent defensive line. Individual French units fought competently. French army as system had ceased functioning, and system failure made tactical competence irrelevant. June 9th, German advance on Paris began. Capital was declared open city, undefended to prevent destruction, and Wehrmacht forces entered suburbs meeting token resistance. France's political and military leadership faced impossible choices. Defend Paris and see it destroyed like Warsaw, or abandon capital without fighting and accept humiliation. They chose survival over symbolism. French government evacuated to Bordeaux. Military headquarters abandoned prepared positions. June 14th, German forces entered Paris, staged propaganda parade down Champs-Élysées, while French civilians watched in shock or stayed indoors in protest. Occupation of Paris had tremendous symbolic value. Germany had besieged Paris in 1870 during Franco-Prussian War but never captured it, had advanced to Marne River in 1914 but been pushed back. Now Wehrmacht soldiers were photographing themselves at Eiffel Tower, eating in Parisian cafes, occupying enemy capital while French campaign was still ongoing. Guderian's armour didn't enter Paris. His corps bypassed capital entirely, continuing southeast towards strategic objectives in eastern France. Taking cities wasn't mission. Destroying French army's capacity to resist was mission. Cities would fall automatically once field armies collapsed. The refugee crisis paralysing France deserves attention because it reveals civilian dimension of military collapse. 8 to 10 million French civilians fled southward ahead of German advance, clogging roads with humanity in panic. This was deliberate flight, not evacuation. Families loading possessions onto cars, carts, bicycles, walking, carrying children, elderly, creating massive migration that blocked military movements. French units attempting to move to defensive positions found roads impassable with refugees. Supply trucks couldn't reach forward units. Artillery couldn't reposition because roads were packed with fleeing civilians. German armour advancing south encountered roads, clogged with refugees, and simply drove around them, moving cross-country while French mechanized forces remained stuck in traffic jams. Luftwaffe strafing attacks on refugee columns, war crime by any standard deliberately worsened crisis, creating terror that accelerated flight and further paralysed French military mobility. Civilian suffering was real and terrible. It was also strategically decisive refugee crisis, prevented French military from moving, creating mobility advantage for German forces that compounded every other German advantage. Modern warfare's horrifying reality, terrorising civilians became operational tool. Guderian's forces drove southeast from Somme breakthrough with objective of reaching Swiss border, cutting off French armies in eastern France from rest of country. This was encirclement on strategic scale, not single army but multiple French army groups, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, trapped against Switzerland and unable to withdraw. French 2nd, 3rd, 5th and 8th armies occupied fortified positions along Maginot Line, facing Germany, positions that had never been attacked because Wehrmacht had bypassed them entirely via Ardennes. Now, Guderian was approaching from rear, threatening to trap these armies in obsolete fortifications. French commanders faced same decision that had confronted Polish generals 9 months earlier: remain in prepared positions and be encircled, or abandon positions and attempt fighting withdrawal through German-controlled territory. Either choice led to defeat. Some units attempted breakout, were destroyed piecemeal by German forces. Others surrendered in place. Eastern France became killing field where tactics and bravery meant nothing because strategic situation was hopeless. June 17th, 1940. French Premier Paul Reynaud resigned, replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain, great war hero, now 84 years old, brought in to negotiate armistice. Pétain's radio address announcing France would seek peace terms was admission of defeat. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must stop fighting. This was 6 weeks after German invasion began. 5 weeks after Sedan breakthrough. France military power that had fielded 3,000 tanks and 100 divisions was surrendering to Germany. After a campaign that cost Wehrmacht approximately 49,000 killed versus French losses of 90,000 killed plus nearly 2 million prisoners. Exchange ratio suggested closely matched forces. Duration suggested rout. Reality was both. French soldiers fought, inflicted casualties, but French army as organisation had dissolved. Psychological collapse preceded military collapse. French command structure lost ability to coordinate responses, lost communication with frontline units, lost situational awareness of where friendly and enemy forces were. Once that happened, battlefield bravery became tragic waste rather than military effectiveness. June 22nd. Compiègne Forest. Same railway car where Germany had signed armistice-ending Great War in November 1918, preserved as memorial to French victory, now hosted German armistice ceremony accepting French surrender. Hitler attended personally, staged ceremony deliberately to humiliate France, forced French representatives to sit in same seats where German delegates had sat 22 years earlier. France was divided. Northern zone occupied by Germany, southern zone unoccupied but controlled by collaborationist Vichy government. French military was disarmed and demobilised. French navy was neutralised through combination of British attacks and self-scuttling. France ceased to exist as military factor, transformed from great power to occupied territory in 6 weeks. Guderian's Panzer Doctrine had been validated at strategic level. Mechanized warfare could destroy great power military forces before they mobilized psychological reserves needed for sustained resistance. Speed had defeated depth. Shock had defeated preparation. Coordination had defeated numerical superiority. The statistical analysis of French campaign reveals pattern that would define German military success in early war years. Dramatic operational victories achieved at sustainable casualty rates against opponents whose organizational systems couldn't match German tempo. Wehrmacht casualties in France: 27,000 killed, 111,000 wounded, 18,000 missing, total 156,000 casualties. French casualties: 90,000 killed, 200,000 wounded, 1.9 million prisoners, total 2.19 million casualties. German tank losses: 757, destroyed or damaged beyond repair, from starting strength of 2,600 tanks, roughly 30% loss rate. These were serious but sustainable losses. Wehrmacht could replace tanks and train new crews within months. But casualty and loss ratios were deceptive indicators of military effectiveness. Germany won because its operational system combined arms, coordination, radio communications, decentralized initiative. Emphasis on speed overwhelmed French organizational system. Technology mattered less than technique. Equipment quality mattered less than employment doctrine. Guderian had been proven correct in most fundamental way. You don't need best tanks, you need best system. The comparison with Great War outcomes makes French collapse even more remarkable. 1914 through 18. France holds despite losing 500,000 casualties in first month, despite German forces reaching Marne River 40 miles from Paris, despite 4 years of grinding attrition. France emerges victorious after 1,560 days of combat. 1940, France collapses in 46 days despite having more tanks than Germany, despite superior tank quality, despite Maginot Line fortifications. What changed? Not French military courage. French soldiers in 1940 fought as bravely as predecessors in Great War. What changed was operational tempo and psychological resilience of command structures. Great War moved slowly enough for French commands to adapt, to absorb defeats, to maintain organizational coherence through successive crises. 1940 moved too fast for adaptation. French command structure shattered before it could evolve responses. Armies are organizations, and organizations can fail systemically while individual components remain functional. France experienced systemic organizational failure in 1940 that hadn't occurred in 1914 through 18, not because soldiers were worse, but because enemy operational system was revolutionary. The human tragedy underlying operational history deserves acknowledgement. 2 million French soldiers became prisoners of war, spending remainder of war in German camps under conditions ranging from difficult to barbaric. 90,000 French soldiers died, each death a family destroyed, a life ended, a future erased. French civilians endured 4 years of occupation, repression, collaboration, resistance, execution. France's defeat created conditions for Holocaust in France, deportation of French Jews, French collaboration in genocide, French territory used as logistics base for Nazi crimes. Guderian's operational brilliance enabled strategic catastrophe. His Panzer forces defeated French army efficiently, and that defeat allowed Nazi Germany to occupy France with all the horror that implied. Technical appreciation of military effectiveness cannot ignore strategic consequences. Guderian was brilliant operational commander. His brilliance served monstrous regime and enabled monstrous outcomes. Both statements are true. Neither cancels the other. France's campaign was triumph of military innovation and prelude to moral catastrophe. Understanding it requires holding both realities simultaneously. July 19th, 1940, Berlin. Adolf Hitler stood before Reichstag announcing promotions for victorious generals. Heinz Guderian was promoted to Generaloberst, Colonel General, equivalent to 4-star rank in other armies. At age 52, after 22 years spent developing armor doctrine in obscurity, resistance, and bureaucratic warfare, Guderian was Germany's most celebrated military theorist. His name appeared in newspapers worldwide. Foreign military attachés requested briefings on Panzer tactics. Guderian's face appeared in propaganda films, showcasing German military prowess. The prophet of mechanized warfare had been vindicated in most spectacular fashion possible. Poland destroyed in weeks, France defeated in a month and a half, British driven from continent. Everything Guderian predicted in Achtung Panzer had come true. Skeptics were silent, critics were dismissed. Conservative generals who opposed independent panzer divisions appeared foolish. Guderian enjoyed a moment of triumph, but even as promotion ceremony proceeded, he was reading casualty reports and maintenance assessments that revealed disturbing patterns beneath the victory celebrations. The aftermath of French campaign provided first comprehensive assessment of German panzer forces' actual performance, and data revealed significant problems obscured by dramatic operational success. Wehrmacht began campaign with approximately 2,600 tanks. After 6 weeks of combat, 757 were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair, 29% total loss. But mechanical breakdown rates were more concerning. At any given moment during campaign, 30 to 40% of German tanks were non-operational due to mechanical failures requiring repair. Average operational availability rate was approximately 65%, meaning if division had 300 tanks on paper, only 200 were actually functional on given day. Guderian reviewed these statistics and recognized what they implied. German armor had defeated France while operating at 2/3 strength due to mechanical unreliability. Victory had occurred because French collapsed organizationally before German equipment failed mechanically. Against opponent with better organization and longer strategic depth, this unreliability would be catastrophic. The international response to France's defeat ranged from shock to analysis to imitation, but few observers drew correct lessons from German success. British military analysts studied French campaign intensely, concluded that concentrated armor plus air support was decisive combination, began forming British armored divisions. Soviet observers reached similar conclusions, accelerated tank production, began reforming Red Army along mechanized warfare principles. The United States military sent observers to study aftermath, filed detailed reports, but Army remained tiny and Congress remained isolationist, so practical application was limited. What most analysts missed was that German victory resulted from system integration rather than technological superiority. Observers saw German tanks and concluded, we need tanks like that. Correct lesson was, we need command structure, communications, doctrine, and training like that. Technology was replaceable, organizational culture was not. Countries that copied German tanks without copying German doctrine would discover to their sorrow that tanks alone didn't create Blitzkrieg. Germany had spent decades developing operational culture of initiative, speed, and combined arms thinking. That couldn't be copied by purchasing similar equipment. Guderian's promotion to Panzer Group commander in August 1940 elevated him to operational leadership of multiple corps, potentially hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles. This was position he had sought his entire career. Authority to implement mechanized warfare doctrine at theatre level, resources to conduct operations as he envisioned them, political backing to override conservative opposition. But promotion came with complications. As corps commander, Guderian had operational freedom to execute missions as he saw fit. As Panzergruppe commander, he was senior enough to attend planning conferences where strategic decisions were made, which meant he could no longer claim ignorance of Nazi regime's broader objectives. He was being integrated into Wehrmacht's senior leadership at a moment when Germany's strategic goals were expanding from dominating Western Europe to ideological war of racial extermination in Eastern Europe. Guderian's technical brilliance was about to be deployed in service of Holocaust and genocide, and he could no longer maintain fiction of political neutrality. The mechanization mythology that developed around Blitzkrieg obscured important reality. Wehrmacht in 1940 was not primarily mechanized army. Of 157 divisions that invaded France, only 16 were Panzer or motorized divisions, roughly 10%. Remaining 90% were traditional infantry divisions moving on foot, supplied by horses, employing tactics that would have been recognizable to Franco-Prussian war commanders. Germany's military modernization was narrow and deep rather than broad. Wehrmacht had created cutting-edge mechanized striking force, but hadn't mechanized the army as whole. This created two-tier military, elite panzer divisions operating at 20th century tempo, supported by 19th century infantry divisions that marched and fought like their grandfathers. Against Poland and France, this worked because panzer divisions achieved breakthrough and exploitation, while infantry divisions followed to occupy territory. But it established a pattern where German strategic success depended on narrow spearhead achieving decisive results before defenders could mobilize reserves. If breakthrough failed, if exploitation was contained, Wehrmacht would be forced into attritional warfare for which it wasn't structured or equipped. This vulnerability was hidden by dramatic early victories, but would be exposed catastrophically in Soviet Union. The warning signs visible to careful observers in summer 1940 suggested limits of Blitzkrieg doctrine that Guderian himself recognized but couldn't politically acknowledge. First, mechanical reliability remained inadequate for sustained operations. German tanks required major overhaul after 6 weeks of campaigning. Second, logistics tail couldn't support extended advances beyond roughly 300 miles without extensive pauses for supply consolidation. Third, doctrine worked brilliantly against opponents whose command structures moved slowly but offered no particular advantage against opponent with similar operational tempo. Fourth, armour remained vulnerable to competent anti-tank defence and needed favourable operational circumstances, surprise, air superiority, enemy disorganisation to succeed. Fifth, Blitzkrieg required short wars because German industrial capacity couldn't sustain extended multi-year conflicts against opponents with superior resources. These limitations weren't fatal against Poland or France. They would be catastrophic against Soviet Union. But in summer 1940, flush with victory, Wehrmacht leadership wasn't inclined to dwell on limitations. Success validated doctrine. Doctrine was perfect. Reality would disagree. The Führer cult within Wehrmacht intensified after French victory in ways that complicated rational military planning. Hitler's political intuition had repeatedly overruled professional military advice and been proven correct. Remilitarizing Rhineland, absorbing Austria and Czechoslovakia, invading Poland, approving Manstein Plan despite General Staff opposition. Now, Wehrmacht senior officers increasingly deferred to Hitler's judgment even on operational questions where his expertise was limited. Guderian participated in this dynamic. He owed his career advancement partly to Hitler's support against conservative generals. But Hitler's successful gambles created a dangerous pattern where Wehrmacht leadership mistook political audacity for military genius. Hitler was a brilliant political opportunist with intuitive understanding of Western democracy's weaknesses. He was not a military strategist. His operational instincts halt order at Dunkirk. Future decisions in Soviet Union would prove disastrous. But after France, Wehrmacht had difficulty distinguishing Hitler's political successes from his military ideas. Institutional culture that should have maintained professional military judgment was being corrupted by a personality cult. Guderian was both beneficiary and victim of this process. The geopolitical situation in summer 1940 presented Germany with strategic choices that would determine war's outcome. Britain remained undefeated, committed to continuing fight, protected by Royal Navy and English Channel. Soviet Union remained technically neutral under Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but was clearly long-term threat and ideological enemy. United States remained neutral but increasingly supportive of Britain. German options: negotiate peace with Britain while dominant in Europe. Prepare invasion of Britain to force capitulation. Ignore Britain and prepare invasion of Soviet Union. Maintain defensive stance and consolidate European conquests. Hitler chose worst option. Prepare invasion of Soviet Union while leaving Britain undefeated, creating two-front war. Guderian's role in this decision was peripheral. He was operational commander, not strategist, but he participated in planning conferences where Soviet invasion was discussed and raised objections about logistics rather than strategic wisdom. His concerns were technical. Could Wehrmacht project power 1,000 miles into Soviet Union with existing logistics capacity? Answer was obviously no. Hitler proceeded anyway. Guderian would command major element of invasion force. His armor doctrine, validated in Poland and France, would be tested in an environment where every advantage Wehrmacht possessed in previous campaigns would be reversed. The moral reckoning of June 1940 remains incomplete in most military histories. France's defeat was operational triumph and humanitarian catastrophe. Wehrmacht victory enabled Nazi occupation, collaboration, repression, Holocaust in France. Guderian's Panzer Corps defeated French military efficiently. An efficient defeat enabled 4 years of evil. Guderian himself wasn't Nazi ideologue. His letters and diaries show man focused on military professionalism rather than political ideology. But political disengagement is itself political position. By summer 1940, Nazi regime's nature was absolutely clear. Concentration camps, persecution of Jews, aggressive war, intention to dominate Europe. Guderian's response was to focus on tanks. He separated technical military questions from strategic political context, drew artificial line between operational effectiveness and purposes for which that effectiveness would be used. This was willful blindness. He was building military instrument for a regime whose goals extended far beyond restoring German power. His doctrine worked brilliantly. It worked to enable genocide. Both are true. Historical March 5, 1941. Wehrmacht Planning Headquarters, Zossen, south of Berlin. Heinz Guderian stood before wall-sized map of Soviet Union, pointer tracing route from East Prussia to Moscow. The distance, roughly 1,000 miles, was marked in red. For comparison, German-French border to English Channel was 400 miles, distance Wehrmacht covered in 10 days during France campaign. Moscow was 2.5 times farther. Guderian listened as logistics officers presented calculations. Existing fuel stocks would sustain advance approximately 600 kilometers, 370 miles, before resupply became necessary. Road network in Western Soviet Union was primitive compared to France, mostly dirt tracks that turned to mud during rain. Railroad gauge changed at Soviet border from standard European width to Russian broad gauge, meaning every supply item would need to be transferred from trains to trucks at border. Wehrmacht truck fleet, already strained in France, would need to haul supplies over distances exceeding truck operational range. The mathematics were unforgiving. Guderian raised concerns about logistics sustainability, was told to focus on operational planning and leave strategic questions to high command. He complied. This was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. Operation Barbarossa invasion of Soviet Union was predicated on assumptions that were simultaneously reasonable and catastrophically wrong. Central assumption: Soviet Union would collapse like France, perhaps faster given Red Army's perceived weaknesses after Stalin's purges. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated Soviet Union possessed 10,000 tanks, actually. Soviets had 24,000. German planners calculated Red Army fielded 170 divisions, actual number was 300. Even had German intelligence been accurate, underlying assumption was flawed. Soviet Union wasn't France. Soviet strategic depth, distance between borders and vital centers, meant losing territory didn't equal losing war. Soviet population 190 million versus France's 40 million meant manpower reserves dwarfed anything Germany could mobilize. Soviet industrial capacity, while less sophisticated than German, was massive and geographically dispersed, difficult to destroy quickly. Most fundamentally, Soviet Union under Stalin operated with ideological fanaticism and political ruthlessness that made psychological collapse unlikely. Wehrmacht was planning to defeat opponent through methods rapid breakthrough, operational shock, command paralysis that had worked against Western democracies but might not, work against totalitarian state willing to accept unlimited casualties. The geographic scale of Barbarossa operation reveals how thoroughly German planning ignored practical constraints. Wehrmacht would attack on front extending 1,800 miles from Baltic Sea to Black Sea, longest front in military history. 3 army groups: north targeting Leningrad, center targeting Moscow, south targeting Ukraine. Guderian commanded Panzer Group 2 within Army Group Center, 5 panzer divisions, 3 motorized divisions, approximately 900 tanks. His initial objectives were Minsk, 200 miles from starting position, Smolensk, 450 miles, then Moscow, 650 miles. These distances exceeded anything attempted in previous campaigns by factors of 3 to 5. French campaign had stretched Wehrmacht logistics to breaking point over 400-mile advance. Barbarossa called for advances exceeding 1,000 miles through territory. With minimal infrastructure, against enemy with unlimited depth to trade for time. German planning assumed either complete Soviet collapse in 6 to 8 weeks or complete German failure. Middle ground extended campaign lasting months or years wasn't seriously considered because Germany lacked resources for extended war. Wehrmacht was launching campaign that had to succeed quickly or would fail catastrophically, and failure would occur deep inside Soviet territory with winter approaching. April 1941. Guderian received intelligence briefing on Soviet armor capabilities that should have alarmed Wehrmacht leadership but didn't. German intelligence reported new Soviet tank designs: T-34 medium tank with sloped armor and 76mm gun, KV-1 heavy tank with 90mm armor and 76mm gun. Technical specifications suggested both designs were superior to any German tank in service. Panzer III's 50mm gun couldn't penetrate T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges. Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm gun was designed for high explosive shells, not armor penetration. Wehrmacht possessed no tank capable of reliably defeating Soviet heavy armor in frontal engagement. Intelligence assessment concluded these new tanks existed only in small numbers, wouldn't significantly affect campaign. This was wishful thinking elevated to operational planning. Soviet Union had produced approximately 960 T-34s and 508 KV tanks by June 1941. These weren't prototypes, they were production vehicles in frontline units. German armor superiority that had existed against Poland and France would not exist against Soviet Union. Wehrmacht was about to discover this through painful experience. The human dimension of Barbarossa planning involved 3.6 million men, largest invasion force in history, preparing for campaign, whose objectives most soldiers didn't understand. German soldiers received ideological indoctrination, presenting invasion as preventive war against Bolshevik threat, crusade to save European civilization from Asian barbarism. This was propaganda covering war of annihilation motivated by Nazi racial ideology and Hitler's desire for Lebensraum, living space, in East. Wehrmacht issued criminal orders before invasion began. Commissar order mandated execution of Soviet political officers. Barbarossa decree exempted German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians. Hunger plan called for deliberate starvation of Soviet urban populations. These orders transformed military operation into genocide. Wehrmacht wasn't just fighting Soviet military, it was implementing a program of racial extermination. Guderian later claimed he wasn't aware of criminal orders or didn't enforce them in his command area. Evidence is ambiguous. Some sources suggest he quietly ignored worst orders. Others indicate his units participated in atrocities. What's certain? Guderian commanded major element of invasion force, conducting war of annihilation, and he continued commanding despite knowing war's nature. May 1941. Final Barbarossa war games produced results that should have caused operations cancellation but were instead dismissed as unrealistic pessimism. Exercise umpires, applying conservative assumptions about Soviet resistance and German logistics, determined Wehrmacht would reach point of culmination moment when offensive capability exhausted approximately 300 miles inside Soviet territory, well short of Moscow. German forces would create large encirclements in border regions but wouldn't destroy Soviet capacity to resist. Extended campaign lasting into winter was probable. Guderian and other Panzer commanders objected violently to these assessments, argued umpires underestimated German operational speed and overestimated Soviet competence. Hitler sided with aggressive commanders. We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. This metaphor, rotten structure, captured German understanding of Soviet Union. Politically unstable, militarily incompetent, psychologically fragile, ready to collapse under initial shock. If this assessment was correct, Barbarossa would succeed spectacularly. If it was wrong, Wehrmacht was launching strategically unsupportable operation into continental-sized country with unlimited manpower, accepting battle under conditions where every factor favoured defender. The gamble was total. There was no fallback plan. The timing of Barbarossa June 22nd invasion date resulted from operational delays but created strategic vulnerability Wehrmacht couldn't overcome. Original invasion was scheduled for May 15th, providing 5 months of good weather before Russian winter. German intervention in Balkans during April and May to bail out Italian failures. In Greece, delayed Barbarossa launch by 5 weeks. This delay would prove catastrophic. 5 weeks lost to spring meant 5 weeks less before winter weather ended mobile operations. Wehrmacht would reach Moscow's suburbs in December with temperatures below -20 Fahrenheit, soldiers in summer uniforms, vehicles without winterization, and insufficient time remaining before winter made sustained operations impossible. If invasion had launched on schedule in May, Wehrmacht might have captured Moscow before autumn rains and winter cold ended campaigning season. Might have beens are speculation, but 5-week delay was real and contributed directly to Barbarossa's failure. Strategic level decision intervening in Balkans compromised operational level execution of far more important campaign. This was patterned throughout Nazi Germany's war. Ideological commitments and political imperatives repeatedly undermined military rationality. Guderian's private assessment of Barbarossa, recorded in letters to his wife and diary entries, reveals man torn between professional confidence in his operational doctrine and recognition that strategic circumstances were unfavourable. He believed Panzer Group II could execute assigned missions, reach Minsk, encircle Soviet forces, advance toward Moscow. He was less certain Wehrmacht, as whole, could achieve strategic objectives before logistics collapsed or winter arrived. His concerns were practical rather than moral. Could German supply lines stretch to Moscow? Would Soviet Union collapse psychologically like France? What happened if Soviets traded space for time, withdrawing rather than standing to be encircled? These were right questions. Answers were all unfavourable to Germany. But Guderian was professional soldier in dictatorship, commanded major invasion element, and had built entire career toward commanding armoured operations at this scale. He would execute orders brilliantly, achieve operational victories that meant nothing strategically, and watch his career end in disaster. Outside Moscow in winter he saw coming but couldn't prevent. The comparison between French campaign and impending Soviet campaign reveals how thoroughly circumstances had reversed against France. Wehrmacht achieved surprise, attacked through unexpected avenue, faced enemy with slower command cycle, operated in compact theatre with good infrastructure, benefited from Allied strategic errors. Against Soviet Union, Soviets expected attack and prepared defences. Wehrmacht had no unexpected approach route. Red Army command structure was similarly fast-paced. Theatre was continental in scale with minimal infrastructure, and Soviet strategy, trading space for time, was sound response to German operational strengths. Wehrmacht was attacking into conditions that neutralised every advantage it possessed. Blitzkrieg doctrine required achieving breakthrough, exploiting into enemy depth, paralysing command structure before reserves. Mobilised. Soviet Union's depth meant exploitation could continue hundreds of miles without reaching vital centres. Soviet command ruthlessness meant catastrophic defeats wouldn't cause systemic collapse. Soviet manpower meant destroyed armies would be replaced. Wehrmacht needed opponent to cooperate in their own defeat through panic or poor decisions. Soviet Union wouldn't cooperate. This asymmetry, German doctrine requiring short war versus Soviet capacity to survive long war, predetermined Barbarossa's outcome. Germany might win initial battles, Soviet Union would win war. June 21st, 1941. Final day of peace. Guderian's Panzer Group, 2 assembled in forests, opposite Soviet border in occupied Poland. 900 tanks, thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of soldiers, waiting for 3:15 a.m. start time. Guderian spent evening writing letter to wife, eating final dinner with staff officers, reviewing operation orders one last time. Around him, Wehrmacht poised to launch largest military operation in history, 3.6 million men, 3,600 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses. Attack front extended from Baltic to Black Sea. Objectives were unlimited: destroy Red Army, occupy Soviet Union west of Urals, establish Nazi racial empire in conquered territories. What Wehrmacht possessed: tactical superiority, operational expertise, combat experience, superior doctrine. What Wehrmacht lacked: strategic depth, industrial capacity, manpower reserves, logistics capability for extended operations, winter equipment. Campaign would test whether tactics and operations could overcome strategic disadvantages. Historical precedent suggested no Napoleon invaded Russia with similar advantages and similar goals, was destroyed by depth and winter. Hitler's response to comparisons with Napoleon: "We're not going in winter." This showed comprehensive misunderstanding of what was about to happen. Wehrmacht was going in summer. They would still be there in winter, having failed to achieve objectives, trapped deep inside enemy territory, facing Soviet counteroffensive with exhausted forces. Guderian understood this was possible. He attacked anyway. 3:15 a.m., June 22nd, 1941, German artillery opened fire. Barbarossa began. Europe's future for next 4 years, and arguably beyond, would be determined by what happened next. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Artillery barrage erupted along 1,800-mile front as Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa. Guderian's Panzer Group 2 crossed Soviet frontier near Brest-Litovsk, spearheading Army Group Center's drive toward Moscow. First reports reaching German headquarters suggested complete surprise achieved, Soviet frontier forces destroyed or retreating in confusion, air attacks destroying Soviet aircraft on ground, border fortifications penetrated without serious resistance. By noon, Guderian's lead elements had advanced 30 miles against minimal opposition. By evening, 50 miles. Radio intercepts indicated Soviet commands requesting instructions, receiving no response, losing contact with higher headquarters. This looked like Poland campaign repeating rapid breakthrough, enemy command paralysis, exploitation into operational depth. Wehrmacht intelligence concluded Soviet collapse was beginning. Officers opened champagne, celebrating what they believed was war's winning opening move. Reality was different. Soviet forces were retreating, but they weren't collapsing. Red Army's strategic plan called for trading border territories to buy time, falling back to prepared defensive lines, mobilizing reserves, while Wehrmacht exhausted itself advancing through empty territory. Germans were achieving breakthrough exactly as planned. Soviets were executing strategic withdrawal exactly as planned. These plans were compatible for moment, which created illusion of German victory obscuring strategic reality. June 28th. Battle of Bialystok-Minsk Encirclement demonstrated both power and limitation of German operational doctrine. Guderian's Panzer Group II drove northeast from Brest-Litovsk, while Hoth's Panzer Group III drove southeast from East Prussia, meeting near Minsk to encircle Soviet forces in salient. In 6 days, Wehrmacht advanced 200 miles and encircled approximately 300,000 Soviet soldiers from several armies. This was operational success exceeding Poland or France campaigns in scale. But problems became apparent immediately. German infantry divisions, marching on foot, couldn't catch up to close pocket. Encircled Soviet forces fought desperately to break out rather than surrendering passively. Thousands of Soviet soldiers escaped eastward through gaps in German lines. Guderian's armour, having achieved encirclement, had to halt and defend pocket perimeter instead of continuing exploitation toward Moscow. Week was lost eliminating Bialystok-Minsk pocket while Soviet reserves established new defensive lines farther east. Pattern emerged that would define Barbarossa. German armour achieved spectacular encirclements that consumed time and resources to reduce, allowing Soviets to mobilize fresh armies behind each destroyed force. Wehrmacht was winning tactically and losing strategically. July 16th. First encounter with Soviet T-34 tank shocked German crews and invalidated Wehrmacht's assumptions about armour superiority. 4th Panzer Division engaged Soviet tank company near Seno, Belarus. German Panzer III tanks opened fire at 800 meters normal engagement range and watched their 50mm rounds bounce off Soviet armour. T-34s, close distance, returned fire, penetrated German tanks easily with 76mm guns. Germans lost 6 tanks in minutes before withdrawing. Unit after action report was alarmed. 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns are ineffective against this tank. Direct hits simply ricochet off sloped armour. Request immediate deployment of 88mm anti-aircraft guns in anti-tank role. Similar reports flooded German commands from across front. Soviet heavy KV tanks proved even more formidable. 90mm armour was impervious to any German tank gun. Wehrmacht possessed no tank that could reliably defeat Soviet heavy armour in frontal combat. German response was tactical adaptation, avoid tank versus tank combat, use 88mm anti-aircraft guns as makeshift anti-tank weapons, call in Stuka attacks, employ indirect approaches. This worked, but revealed German technical inferiority Wehrmacht planners hadn't anticipated. August 5th, Battle of Smolensk Encirclement, second massive pocket created by Army Group Center, demonstrated that Soviet resistance was intensifying rather than collapsing. Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups encircled another 300,000 Soviet soldiers near Smolensk, 450 miles from starting positions. But reducing pocket required 3 weeks of heavy fighting. Soviet forces inside encirclement fought with determination that stunned German commanders accustomed to Polish and French collapses. Breakout attempts were continuous and sometimes successful. Soviet artillery fire was accurate and devastating. Red Army soldiers fought to death rather than surrendering in many cases. German casualties mounted. Panzer Group II's strength declined from 900 tanks in June to 260 operational tanks by August. 71% loss rate in 6 weeks. Most losses were mechanical failures rather than combat damage, but combat attrition was also severe. Soviet counterattacks, while tactically unsuccessful, inflicted steady casualties Wehrmacht couldn't easily replace, and, most concerning, beyond each destroyed Soviet army appeared fresh. Soviet army pulling back, but intact, continuing resistance, Soviet Union wasn't collapsing. It was absorbing defeats and reconstituting forces. Wehrmacht was winning battles and not winning war. The logistics crisis, German staff officers predicted, materialized exactly on schedule in July and August. Guderian's Panzer Group operated 400 miles from German frontier by late July, beyond sustainable truck range for fuel and ammunition resupply. German trucks, designed for European paved roads, broke down on Soviet dirt tracks at catastrophic rates. By August, 30% of Wehrmacht's truck fleet was inoperable due to mechanical failures. Railroads couldn't compensate because converting Soviet broad-gauge track to European standard gauge required time and materials Wehrmacht didn't have. Supply situation became desperate. Ammunition rationed, fuel strictly controlled, food sometimes scarce. German units began, depending on captured Soviet supplies, exact strategy that had worked in France but was less reliable against enemy who scorched earth during retreats. Guderian personally visited supply dumps behind his front lines, found them nearly empty, returned to forward positions knowing his offensive capability was exhausted by logistics rather than enemy action. Wehrmacht had advanced too far, too fast, and couldn't sustain operations at tempo necessary for decisive victory. The mathematics logistics officers presented in March were proving accurate. Wehrmacht was reaching point of culmination, maximum sustainable advance, approximately where predicted, which meant Moscow remained unreachable with current resources. August 25th, Hitler issued directive that would prove decisive to Barbarossa's failure. Guderian's Panzer Group II would turn south from Moscow axis to assist in encirclement of Soviet forces in Ukraine, rather than continuing towards Soviet capital. This decision, diverting Army Group Center's armor away from primary objective, resulted from strategic debate within Wehrmacht about Barbarossa's priorities. Hitler wanted to capture Ukraine's agricultural and industrial resources. Army Chief of Staff Halder wanted to capture Moscow, believing capital's fall would break Soviet resistance. Guderian argued vehemently for Moscow Drive, was overruled, ordered south. The resulting Kiev encirclement was largest in history, 600,000 Soviet prisoners, but consumed September and early October, precious time before winter. When Wehrmacht finally resumed Moscow offensive in early October, autumn rains had begun, roads turned to mud, and campaigning season was nearly exhausted. Strategic debate consumed 6 weeks that might have been decisive. Instead of capturing Moscow in August or September, while weather permitted sustained operations, Wehrmacht captured Kiev and approached Moscow in late autumn, with winter approaching. Tactical success achieved strategic failure. This pattern prioritizing secondary objectives over primary ones. Winning battles that didn't advance strategic goals characterized Wehrmacht operations throughout Eastern Campaign. The human cost of summer 1941's combat dwarfed anything Wehrmacht experienced in previous campaigns and provided early indication of Eastern War's character. German casualties, June through August: 170,000 killed, 600,000 wounded, 770,000 total casualties in 10 weeks. This exceeded total German casualties in Poland and France campaigns combined. Soviet casualties were astronomical, approximately 2.8 million killed, captured or wounded in first 10 weeks losses that would have destroyed any previous opponent completely. But Soviet manpower reserves meant even these catastrophic losses were sustainable. Stalin mobilized 5.3 million reservists by August 1st, replacing destroyed armies faster than Wehrmacht could eliminate them. German soldiers experienced continuous combat without relief, fighting enemy who kept appearing in unexpected strength after supposedly being destroyed. Letters home reflected shock. We were told Soviet Union would collapse in weeks. Instead, we're fighting an enemy who doesn't know he's beaten. Psychological toll mounted alongside physical casualties. German tactical excellence remained superior to Soviet equivalents, but excellence wasn't enough when enemy possessed unlimited manpower and willingness to accept unlimited casualties. The encounter with Soviet KV-2 heavy tank in early August revealed both Soviet technological capability and organizational dysfunction. German forces near Versailles, Lithuania, fought two-day battle against single KV-2 tank blocking critical highway. Tank's 152mm howitzer destroyed multiple German vehicles. Its armor shrugged off anti-tank fire. Germans eventually destroyed it using 88mm anti-aircraft gun at point-blank range, discovered crew had died from ammunition cook-off, not crew compartment penetration. KV-2 represented Soviet design philosophy, massive, heavily armoured, mounting, enormous gun, technologically impressive. But it was mechanically unreliable, difficult to maintain, required extensive training to operate effectively. Many KV-2s broke down or were abandoned due to mechanical failures rather than combat damage. This pattern, excellent design, poorly implemented, characterized much Soviet equipment in 1941. Soviet Union possessed technological capability to build weapons matching or exceeding German equivalents. Soviet military organization couldn't effectively employ these weapons because Stalin's purges had killed experienced officers. Training was inadequate. Doctrine was confused. Wehrmacht faced enemy with better equipment but worse organization. The question was whether German organizational superiority could overcome Soviet quantitative and technical advantages before Wehrmacht exhausted itself. By September, answer was becoming clear. Probably not. September 1st, 1941, 70 days into Barbarossa. Wehrmacht had advanced up to 400 miles, destroyed multiple Soviet armies, captured millions of prisoners, occupied vast territories. Yet strategic objectives remained unachieved. Leningrad not captured, Moscow not approached, Soviet Union not collapsed, Red Army not defeated. German casualties approached 800,000. Tank strength across entire Eastern Front declined from 3,600 to roughly 1,000 operational vehicles. Fuel reserves were critically low. Ammunition stocks were depleted. Wehrmacht was exhausted, overstretched, and approaching winter without achieving decisive victory. Guderian's assessment, recorded in diary, captured German strategic dilemma. We have defeated every Soviet force we engaged. They keep producing new forces. We advance continually. Moscow grows no closer. We win every battle. We are not winning the war. This recognition that tactical and operational success weren't producing strategic victory came too late to change German planning. Wehrmacht was committed. Moscow offensive would proceed regardless of exhaustion, logistics, limitations, or approaching winter. Blitzkrieg doctrine that worked spectacularly in Poland and France was failing in Soviet Union, not because doctrine was wrong, but because circumstances were completely different. Wehrmacht was learning limit of operational brilliance. It can't overcome strategic impossibility. The learning process would be catastrophic. October 2nd, 1941. Operation Typhoon Final Wehrmacht, offensive toward Moscow, began with Guderian's Panzer Group, 2 redesignated 2nd Panzer Army, attacking from south, while other German forces attacked from west and north. After 6 weeks diverted to Ukraine, German armour finally resumed drive on Soviet capital, objective that should have been reached in August, now being attempted in October with winter approaching. Initial success was dramatic. Multiple Soviet armies encircled at Vyazma and Bryansk, 600,000 more prisoners, path to Moscow apparently open. German propaganda announced imminent victory, declared Soviet Union on verge of final collapse. Guderian's forward elements advanced to within 70 miles of Moscow by late October. Then weather destroyed German offensive capability more effectively than Soviet resistance. Autumn rains Rasputitsa season turned Soviet dirt roads into impassable mud. German vehicles bogged down, unable to move. Supplies couldn't reach forward units. Offensive halted not from enemy action but from meteorological reality. Wehrmacht planners should have anticipated but didn't adequately prepare for. 2-week delay followed while roads slowly became passable. By time offensive resumed mid-October, precious time was lost, and Soviet reserves were digging in around Moscow. November 7th. First snow fell on German forward positions. Temperature dropped to -10 Fahrenheit overnight. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, experienced cold they were psychologically and physically unprepared for. Wehrmacht quartermaster had failed catastrophically. Winter clothing for 3.6 million soldiers hadn't been manufactured, transported, or distributed because German planning assumed campaign would end before winter. Boots were inadequate for Russian cold. Soldiers suffered frostbite by thousands. Vehicles weren't winterized, engines wouldn't start, lubricants froze solid, fuel lines cracked. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, already reduced from 900 tanks to 130 operational, watched operational strength decline further as tanks became immobile from mechanical cold weather failures. Soviet forces, equipped with winter, uniforms and weapons designed for extreme cold, maintained combat effectiveness while German capability collapsed. Wehrmacht was discovering that operational skill and tactical superiority meant nothing when soldiers couldn't survive environment and equipment wouldn't function. Modern warfare's brutal lesson: logistics and preparation matter more than courage or doctrine. November 22nd. Guderian's reconnaissance elements reached Kashira, approximately 70 miles south of Moscow, closest German approach to Soviet capital. From forward positions, German officers could observe Moscow's suburbs through field glasses. They had come 1,000 miles from German frontier, destroyed multiple Soviet armies, suffered catastrophic casualties, exhausted equipment and men, and now sat tantalizingly close to objective while being unable to advance further. Tank strength was approximately 5% of invasion starting levels. Fuel was critically short. Ammunition was rationed. Soldiers were dying from frostbite faster than from combat. Soviet resistance was intensifying as Siberian divisions, fresh troops equipped for winter warfare, reinforced Moscow defenses. Guderian recognized the situation was unsustainable, recommended withdrawal to defensible positions, was ordered to hold current lines and prepare for renewed offensive. Wehrmacht had achieved maximum penetration into Soviet Union and couldn't advance further, couldn't hold indefinitely, couldn't withdraw without permission. This was culmination point moment, when operational capability exhausted and defender gained initiative. December 5, 1941, Soviet counteroffensive began along entire front around Moscow. 1 million fresh Soviet troops, Siberian divisions transferred from Manchurian border after intelligence confirmed Japan wouldn't attack Soviet Union, attacked German positions held by exhausted, frozen, undersupplied Wehrmacht forces. Temperature reached -40 Fahrenheit. German weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold. German vehicles couldn't maneuver. German soldiers, many suffering from frostbite or exhaustion, couldn't mount effective defense. Soviet forces, equipped for winter combat and fighting to defend capital, advanced against German positions that began collapsing. Within 72 hours, Wehrmacht's situation went from exhausted stalemate to catastrophic retreat. German units abandoned equipment and withdrew westward, suffering casualties from cold equal to combat losses. Vehicles were abandoned when they wouldn't start. Artillery was left behind because horses died from cold or starvation. Wehrmacht was experiencing defeat unlike anything in German military history, not tactical defeat in battle, but systemic collapse from environmental conditions and logistical failure. December 19th, Hitler summoned Guderian to Wolfschanze headquarters in East Prussia, demanded explanation for retreat of 2nd Panzer Army without authorization. Guderian, who had violated halt orders during France campaign and been praised, now discovered that unauthorized retreat produced opposite response. He argued passionately. Soldiers were dying from cold, equipment was non-functional, Soviet counteroffensive was overwhelming exhausted German positions. Continued defense would result in complete destruction of Wehrmacht units. Hitler's response was fury, not one step back. Hold all positions regardless of casualties. Generals who couldn't follow orders would be relieved. Confrontation escalated. Guderian, exhausted and bitter, made mistake of arguing back against direct order from dictator. December 25th, Christmas Day, Guderian was relieved of command, recalled to Germany, effectively fired from Wehrmacht after 22 years of service. The Panzer warfare pioneer who had revolutionized operational doctrine, who had proven theories through spectacular victories in Poland and France, who had advanced further into Soviet Union than any other German commander, was dismissed in defeat. His career built on aggressive violation of conventional wisdom ended when aggression failed and wisdom proved correct. The statistical analysis of Barbarossa's failure reveals precisely where and how Wehrmacht operational system broke down. German casualties, June through December 1941. 750,000 killed, wounded, or missing, approximately 25% of invasion force. Tank losses, 2,300 of 3,600 tanks destroyed, damaged, or inoperable, 64% loss rate. Truck losses, 200,000 of 600,000 trucks, 33% of Wehrmacht's motorized logistics capacity. Soviet casualties, same period, approximately 4.4 million killed, 3.2 million prisoners, massive equipment losses, catastrophic by any measure, but sustainable due to Soviet manpower reserves and industrial production. By January 1942, Red Army fielded more troops than at invasion start, despite suffering losses that would have destroyed any other country. Wehrmacht was weaker than June 1941. Strategic balance had shifted irreversibly. Germany could no longer win through operational brilliance because operational capability was exhausted. Soviet Union could win through strategic endurance because its resources exceeded German capacity to destroy them. The winter retreat from Moscow demonstrated difference between tactical withdrawal and strategic defeat. Wehrmacht conducted fighting retreat, maintaining unit cohesion in most cases, inflicting casualties on pursuing Soviet forces, eventually stabilizing front line approximately 100 to 200 miles west of maximum penetration. From tactical perspective, German forces performed professionally under catastrophic conditions. From strategic perspective, Wehrmacht had been defeated, Moscow wasn't, captured. Soviet Union didn't collapse. Red Army retained combat capability and took offensive initiative. Most significantly, Wehrmacht lost irreplaceable resources, trained soldiers, experienced officers, equipment, time that could never be fully reconstituted. German army that retreated from Moscow in winter 1941 was qualitatively different from army that invaded in June. Smaller, weaker, less confident, facing enemy that was stronger, better organized, and defending home territory with unlimited reserves. Blitzkrieg doctrine, rapid breakthrough, operational exploitation, psychological collapse of enemy had failed definitively. Wehrmacht would continue fighting for 3 more years, would achieve tactical victories, but would never again threaten Soviet Union strategically. Moscow marked transformation from German offensive war to defensive war that Germany ultimately couldn't win. Guderian's personal aftermath relieved of command, career seemingly ended, reputation damaged reflected Wehrmacht leadership crisis as generals who expressed doubts about Hitler's strategy were systematically purged. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, army commander-in-chief, suffered heart attack in December and was replaced by Hitler personally taking command. General Halder, chief of general staff who had opposed Barbarossa timeline, was fired in 1942. Dozens of corps and division commanders were relieved for retreating without authorization. Wehrmacht was purging precisely those officers whose professional military judgment might have prevented catastrophic strategic errors. Pattern was clear. Hitler rewarded aggressive subordinates when aggression succeeded, punished them when aggression failed, and systematically eliminated voices advocating caution or retreat. This created military culture where professional judgment was subordinated to political loyalty, where operational reality was ignored in favor of ideological conviction. Guderian had benefited from this culture during his rise. Hitler's support against conservative generals enabled his career. Now he was victim of same culture. Dictatorships reward success and punish failure without consistency or rationality. Guderian was learning this through personal experience. The technological and doctrinal lessons Wehrmacht learned from Barbarossa came too late to change war's outcome, but transformed German tactical doctrine for remaining campaigns. T-34 superiority forced development of more powerful German tanks, Panzer V, Panther and Panzer VI Tiger, both with heavier armour and larger guns than 1941 models. Soviet tactics, defence in depth, willingness to accept encirclement while continuing resistance, trading space for time forced Wehrmacht to adapt operationally. Soviet willingness to accept casualties that would have broken Western armies required German commanders to recognize that destroying Soviet units didn't equal defeating Soviet Union. These lessons improved Wehrmacht tactical effectiveness, but couldn't overcome strategic disadvantages. Soviet industrial capacity outproduced Germany by massive margins. Soviet manpower reserves were essentially unlimited. Soviet geographic depth made decisive victory impossible. Wehrmacht became more effective tactically while losing strategically. Pattern that would continue until final defeat in May 1945. The moral horror underlying Barbarossa's operational history finally demands full acknowledgement. Wehrmacht's advance into Soviet Union wasn't merely a military campaign, it was enabling structure for Holocaust in Eastern Europe and genocide of Soviet civilians. Einsatzgruppen SS murder squads followed Wehrmacht into Soviet territory, systematically murdering Jews, communist officials, Roma, and other targeted populations. Wehrmacht provided logistics support, security, and in many cases, direct participation in mass killings. Guderian commanded forces, operating in areas where genocide was being perpetrated by units under Wehrmacht authority. His post-war claims of ignorance aren't credible murder operations occurred in areas his command controlled, using Wehrmacht resources, sometimes with Wehrmacht participation. Connection between military effectiveness and genocide wasn't incidental. Successful military advance enabled genocidal forces to reach victim populations. Guderian's tactical brilliance made Holocaust in Soviet Union possible. This is historical reality that cannot be evaded through claims of political neutrality or focus on military professionalism. Wehrmacht in Soviet Union was instrument of genocidal war, and all Wehrmacht commanders bear responsibility for crimes committed by forces they commanded or enabled. December 31st, 1941. Guderian spent New Year's Eve in Berlin, unemployed, career apparently finished, watching Wehrmacht struggle to stabilize Eastern Front against Soviet counteroffensives. The Panzer warfare pioneer who revolutionized operational doctrine, who achieved spectacular victories in Poland and France, who advanced further into Soviet Union than any other German commander, was dismissed in defeat outside Moscow. His doctrine of rapid breakthrough and exploitation had worked brilliantly against unprepared opponents in confined theatres with good infrastructure. It had failed against enemy with unlimited depth, massive reserves, and willingness to accept catastrophic casualties. Blitzkrieg wasn't wrong, it was limited. It could achieve operational victories but couldn't overcome strategic disadvantages. Guderian's legacy was contradictory. Genuine military innovator who transformed armoured warfare, serving monstrous regime in genocidal war of aggression. Brilliant operational commander whose brilliance enabled catastrophe, revolutionary theorist who proved both possibilities and limitations of mechanized warfare. He would return to Wehrmacht service in 1943 as Inspector General of Panzer Troops, attempting to rebuild shattered armour force, but would never again command field operations. His moment had passed. Blitzkrieg's moment had passed. Wehrmacht would fight on for 3 more years, increasingly desperately, toward inevitable defeat. Guderian had seen future of warfare in 1918 at Cambrai. He had created that future through 2 decades of preparation and advocacy, and he had watched that future destroy itself in Russian winter, proving that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. His story, triumph and tragedy, inseparably intertwined, embodied Wehrmacht's story. Revolutionary military effectiveness, serving flawed strategy in service of evil ends, achieving spectacular victories that ultimately meant nothing because strategic context was catastrophic. That was Guderian's legacy. That was Blitzkrieg's legacy. Innovation without wisdom, effectiveness without morality, victory without purpose, and final defeat that was inevitable from moment first tank crossed Soviet frontier in June 1941.